Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our summit today on Healing and Thriving, a national summit on children of immigrants. I'm Bob Sanborn. I'm President and CEO of Children at Risk in Texas, also one of the chairs of the Texas Family Leadership Council. And I want to thank you guys here for this very important couple of hours where we focus on children of immigrants in our country. I want to first thank our staff that have worked on this. Lindsay Wilkerson, Lisa Cordoba-Leon, Jael Ross, all who've done a great job, many others on the team and from other teams that have done a great job at putting this together. Let me thank our sponsors. First off, CLASP, we're happy to have them as one of our sponsors. And CLASP is the Center for Law and Social Policy. We're excited to have them here. Also, we want to thank the Merrick Family Foundation for bringing in Rice University's Baker Institute, the Center for the United States and Mexico, the Rational Middle with our good buddy over there, Stan Merrick, and the Center for Houston's Future. We're excited to have them as our sponsors. And then our event partners, of course, we couldn't have done this without the Children's Partnership out in Los Angeles. We're excited on this event with them. And of course, the Children's Thrive Action Network, CTAN. We're excited to have them be a part of this, and the Texas Family Leadership Council, of course. And one of the things, I just want to say a few words before I introduce Gabriela as our moderator. A couple of weeks ago, I did a press conference when we had all this stuff happening at the Texas border with children. It was a heart-wrenching time, and we were working with many of our partners on the border. And one of the U.S. senators in Texas asked me to do a press conference with him. And if you're wondering which senator, it wasn't the one that everyone hates. It's the other one. And so I did this. And at one point, someone from Univision asked me a question about something about the problem at the border. And I answered him, and I said, really, the problem and the challenge is not at the border. The problem is in Washington, D.C., where for many years now, our public officials have refused to be bold and to really address what is a dire situation. And so as we go forward today, we're going to be bold, and we're looking forward to this great lineup of speakers, partners, and people that have been very thoughtful about what's happening around immigration, what's happening with our children and our families. This is a key issue in the United States. It's a key issue around the world, but for us, we can control this, right? We can do more with this. We can be bold. So with that, Gabriela Barbosa is from our friends at the Children's Partnership in Los Angeles. She is the Director of Policy out there. And Gabriela, I know you're going to do a great job today, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanborn. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabriela Barbosa. I am the Managing Director of Policy at the Children's Partnership. We are a California-based child advocacy organization dedicated to advancing child health equity through public policy, research, and community engagement. As a daughter of immigrants and the first generation of my family to grow roots in the United States, I feel an immense privilege of being the MC for today's summit that is focused on uplifting opportunities for supporting the well-being of children and immigrant families through immigration policy, healthcare access, public benefits, grassroots organizations, and more. Children of immigrants are the fastest growing segment of the population under 18. In some states like California, where I'm from, children of immigrants make up nearly half of the child population. It's clear that our nation's present and future is inextricably linked to their ability to grow up safe, stable, supported, and healthy. I now have the great honor of introducing our first speaker, who will use data to paint a picture of who children and immigrant families are in the United States. Our first speaker is Wendy Cervantes, who is the Director of Immigration and Immigrant Families at the Center for Law and Social Policy. In this role, she oversees the organization's cross-team work to develop and advocate for policies that support low-income immigrants and their families. Having held leadership roles in various advocacy and community-based organizations, Wendy is an expert on the cross-sector policy issues that impact children of immigrants, including economic security, child welfare, immigration, education, healthcare, and human rights. She is also the proud daughter of Mexican immigrants. Wendy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gabriela, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I would also like to extend my welcome on behalf of CLASP, as well as the Children Thrive Action Network, which I'll speak about in more detail later on. So as Gabrielle said, to get us started for today's event, I'm going to spend a few minutes providing an overview of who we're referring to when we say children of immigrants. Next slide, please. So first of all, children of immigrants in the US are defined for purposes of today's summit as children with one or more parent who is a non-citizen. Currently, 1 in 4 children in the US are the children of immigrants, and they represent one of the fastest growing child populations. The vast majority, well over 90%, are US born citizens, and all are part of our future, just like every child in America. And as you can see, children of immigrants are all over the US, and the share varies by state from just about 3% in West Virginia to nearly half, as Gabriela said, in California. Next slide. Children of immigrants are also racially and ethnically diverse and come from many different parts of the world. Looking specifically at the young child population, those under 6, more than 50% of children of immigrants are Latinx, 17% are white, another 17% are Asian, and a growing number are Black. So it's important to remember that as we think about what racial equity means for our children, that we also need to address how systemic racism, which has shaped many of our immigration laws and policies, impacts children and immigrant families as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of children in immigrant families are US born citizens, and most live in what we call mixed status families, meaning that not all members of the family have the same immigration status. Most children of immigrants do have parents with some form of lawful status, such as those whose parents are lawful permanent residents or green card holders. But about 5.2 million children have at least one parent who is undocumented and therefore at risk of being detained or deported by immigration authorities. Less than 1 million, or about 728,000 children under the age of 18 are themselves undocumented, and they're also commonly referred to as dreamers. These are children who may qualify or eventually qualify once they are 15 years old for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, which provides 2 years of renewable work authorization and protection from deportation to beneficiaries who entered the US as children and who meet the program's requirements. About 250,000 US citizen children have parents with DACA, as many DACA recipients are now in their mid to late 20s and have families. And more than 279,000 US citizen children live in households with family members with temporary protected status, or TPS, from El Salvador, Honduras, or Haiti. And as many of you know, both the DACA program and TPS have faced significant threats in recent years, creating anxiety for recipients and their families, many who have grown up here or lived here for decades, about possibly losing their status, losing their employment, and even possible family separation. Next slide. Today, we'll also be talking about children who have recently arrived in the US, including those arriving at the southwest border in search of asylum. You've seen many of these children and families in the headlines in recent years. The majority of these migrants are coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, although they come to our southwest border from other countries around the world as well. And many are escaping violence, gang-related crime, poverty, as well as looking to reunite with family in the US. While the majority of the children, particularly those arriving alone, are between 15 to 17 years old, we've seen children who are increasingly younger. 6 years old, for example, is the average age of a child being held in a family detention facility in the US, as well as the age of those who were separated by the Trump administration's horrifying zero tolerance policy. I also just want to clarify the difference between the term unaccompanied and accompanied. Accompanied children are those who are arriving with a parent, or other family member or guardian. Unaccompanied children are defined by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, as those who enter the country without their parent or legal guardian, and those who have been separated from their parent or legal guardian for other reasons. ORR reports that about 27,417 unaccompanied children have been released to sponsors in the US in fiscal year 2021 alone. So these are children and youth who are now attending our schools and are part of our communities. And as of June 14th, more than 15,000 children are under the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, including those that are housed in large facilities around the country. Next slide. So I know I went through a lot of statistics and data, but of course, children are not just numbers. As a daughter of Mexican immigrants myself, the wife of a Guatemalan immigrant, and the mother of 2 little girls, the issues we're going to cover today are deeply personal to me and to many of us. Topics will range today from federal immigration policy to the pandemic to mental health and other issues, and all will make it clear that immigration policy is a children's issue and that our policies simply are not working for kids. We know what children need. They need stable, loving caregivers, a place to live, plenty of nutritious food to eat, high quality childcare and education opportunities from pre-K through higher education, and economically stable families that have the resources to make ends meet. Yet too often our immigration policies undermine the ability of children of immigrants to achieve their full potential. And under the previous administration, we saw some of the most dangerous policy attacks on children of immigrants that literally threatened every basic aspect of child well-being with long-term developmental consequences. But we do have an opportunity now to do better, to start the healing and lay the groundwork for children of immigrants to thrive. That's what we hope to dig deeper into today with all of you. Next slide. And as promised, I just wanted to share a little bit more about the Children Thrive Action Network, or CTAN, a new national network dedicated to supporting and defending children of immigrants in the US. The goal of the network is to center children in mixed status families and advocacy on immigration and other intersecting policies. Many of us hosting today's summit are part of the leadership of the network, and we're currently comprised of over 90 active members and allies representing a wide variety of local, state, and national organizations who work directly with or on behalf of children and immigrant families. Membership spans at least 20 states, and we have expertise in a variety of areas, everything from immigration, education, healthcare, nutrition, housing, labor, and more. And so I've included CTAN's website here for more information, including how to sign up as a member. So I'm now going to shift us to the next segment of today's summit, which is a recent video premiere event that CTAN hosted as part of our effort to shape the immigration policy conversation from a children's perspective. The video celebration, titled "I Heart My Immigrant Family," features members of Congress, artists, activists, entrepreneurs, all immigrants or the children of immigrants, explaining through their own stories why CTAN's 3 guiding policy principles are so important to the future of our country. These principles include a path to citizenship, equitable access to education, healthcare, and other critical supports, and immigration policies that uphold family unity and child well-being. So today we're going to share a 5-minute segment from the video that focuses on our first principle, a path to citizenship. We, of course, invite you to check out the entire piece when you have a chance, which is also available on the CTAN website. So with that, I'll turn it over to the video.
I love my sister.
We love our Nani and Poppy.
I love my papa. We love you, Humane.
We love our grandparents.
We love our immigrant family. Thank you for being who you are.
We can finally redefine what it means to be a welcoming nation, what it means to be a country that honors the contribution of our immigrants, and most importantly, what it means to bet on our children's future regardless of their background. And so that's what today is about. So let's get started.
It's no secret that our immigration system is broken. And it's not nearly enough just to overturn the racist and xenophobic policies of the Trump administration. We actually need to take immediate steps to reform our immigration system in a humane way that promotes dignity, respect, and family unity. That's why I've been working in Congress to introduce legislation like my Roadmap to Freedom resolution, My Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, and the HEAL Act, which guarantees that immigrants, those with and without status alike, have the health care they need. We also need to pass the US Citizenship Act, a critical, necessary, and comprehensive reform to our immigration system. There is still so much more work to be done to ensure that we fix our broken immigration system and restore America's place as a beacon of hope. And at the end of the day, we have to guarantee that immigrants can not only get by, but thrive.
Hi, my name is Daishi Miguel Tanaka, and I'm a Filipino-Japanese DACA recipient. I came to America when I was 6 years old with my parents on tourist visas. My grandparents were naturalized US citizens living in Southern California, so we moved there, believing that they can sponsor us through the family-based immigration system. And we had no intentions of becoming undocumented, but we spent months getting thrown around different attorneys, getting conflicting advice, and just quite frankly, bad representation. Eventually, we learned that there is a visa backlog that would result in a 25-year wait for Filipinos in our situation. But throughout that time, I was already attending school in the US, learned English, and I felt at home. I begged my parents that I wanted to stay here. And my parents decided that despite the financial hardships that would come with being undocumented workers, they would do anything in their power to support me so I can finish school and build a future here in this country that I call home. My parents often worked in elderly care nursing homes for very little wages, often being mistreated and taken advantage of by their employers. I did not understand why their employers would often withhold their paychecks from them and why my mom would be in tears. I did not understand why my family, unlike our neighbors, couldn't own a home or a car. And when I watched TV, I did not understand why mainstream conversations about immigration kept forgetting stories of Asian Americans when 1 out of every 7 Asian immigrant is undocumented. When I was in college, my parents' health started to decline, and they decided to leave this country to receive adequate health care and stability. Our current system stipulates that if someone has just enough illegal presence in the US, they are banned from re-entering the country for at least 10 years. And at that time, former President Trump rescinded the DACA program that I benefited from, and thereby rescinded my ability to leave the US and return. So for the past 5 years, I have not seen my family aside from looking through the lens of a webcam, and I just miss them so much. Look, we've been hanging on to this hope that the US Citizenship and Immigration Services will process my grandfather's application to sponsor all of us. But a few months ago, I just learned the devastating news that my grandfather, my Lolo, passed away, leaving us no path for us to gain legal residency. The backlog won, the broken system won. And I urge Congress to take action to fix this system so I can have a path to citizenship and finally be with my family and reunite in this country that I call home.
I'm here because my parents' many years of labor, love, and support, but also because of their good luck. Today, too many immigrant parents are left to struggle against the arbitrary and unfair rules of our immigration system to keep their families together. We need a pathway to citizenship to give stability and security to immigrant children and families working hard in pursuit of their American dream. From dreamers to farm workers to TPS holders, millions of immigrants call the United States home.
So we just heard very powerful messages. And if one thing is clear, is that everyone who took part in this program has a role to play in our world. All of us together can change the world. But to do that, we need your help. We need you to call your representative and your senator and tell them to create a pathway to citizenship right now. Recruit your family, your friends, and ask all of them to spread the word. To everyone that was involved in creating this beautiful tapestry of our country, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing that. That was incredibly moving. And we really encourage you all to join us with the Children Thrive Action Network to support children immigrant families. All right, so let's get started discussing the issues and actions that you all heard mentioned in the video. I'd now like to introduce our moderator and panelists for our first panel focused on federal immigration policy, opportunities and implications for children. Miriam, Sonia, and Shelby, if you can please turn your videos on at this time. Thank you. So the moderator for today is Miriam Abaya, who is the Senior Director for Immigration and Children's Rights at First Focus. Previously, she was a policy analyst at the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, where she advocated for immigration policies that would protect the best interests and rights of unaccompanied children in government custody. Miriam is Nigerian American and grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. She is the graduate of Temple University, Beasley School of Law. Next, I'd like to introduce Sonia Lin. Sonia is currently the Executive Strategy Director of the We Are Home campaign, which is the leading coalition pushing for a path to citizenship and to rebuild the U.S. immigration system. Previously, she was General Counsel and Deputy Commissioner of New York City's Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, where she helped build the largest municipal level office dedicated to immigrant rights, equity, and well-being in the country. Finally, I'd like to introduce Shelby Gonzalez. Shelby is Vice President of Immigration Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where she focuses primarily on leading the center's work related to access to public benefit and other supports for immigrants and their families. Shelby also provides strategic direction related to implementation of effective outreach and program strategies to promote enrollment and retention and benefit programs. Next, I'd like to introduce Robert Cotter. Robert is a policy analyst at the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Okay, Miriam, I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Gabriela, and good morning, everyone. As Wendy mentioned earlier, the current political moment is a historic opportunity for federal policy that supports children of immigrants and their families. We have a new administration, one that released an immigration reform bill with a pathway to citizenship on day one. We also have a new Congress with champions dedicated to introducing and passing bills that support children of immigrants and their families. And this opportunity comes after 4 years of harmful policies that directly threaten the health, safety, and well-being of children of immigrants. From cruel policies that separated families at the border and forced asylum-seeking children and families back to Mexico, to increased interior enforcement that separated families, threats to DACA and temporary protected status, and policies like public charge that made it even more difficult for families to access critical health and nutrition benefits, even during the height of a pandemic. Now is the time to go beyond undoing the harms of the past and to move forward with policies and laws that fully support children of immigrants and their families, leading to thriving and prosperous lives and futures for all of us. So I'm so excited to be joined by Sonia, Robert, and Shelby to talk about what this new political context means for children of immigrants and their families growing up in the US, as well as migrant children and families seeking safety at our southwest border. So Sonia, I'll start by asking you about opportunities in the new Congress. Why is it important to be pushing for a pathway to citizenship this year? What bills have been introduced in Congress that could help? And why is citizenship so important for children?
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you to the organizers of this very timely and urgent summit. I'm Sonia. I am the Executive Strategy Director at the We Are Home campaign. Before sort of answering your question, Miriam, I'll share a little bit more about the campaign. We are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition of over 100 organizations, labor unions, faith groups, calling on the Biden administration and Congress to take immediate action to protect millions of immigrants who call this country home and end the cruelty of our interior detention and deportation system. As a campaign, we are committed to pushing for every opportunity and using every legislative vehicle and executive action to undo the cruelty of the Trump administration, build a new immigration system that is fair, humane, functional, and create a roadmap to citizenship for every immigrant who calls this country home. It is an all of the above strategy because immigrant families have waited too long and we've been promised change too often. Our communities are holding us accountable and we must deliver. As Miriam noted, there is urgency now after the last 4 years of the previous administration, the past 18 months of this ongoing pandemic. We are carrying pain and suffering. We are holding the love of our communities, our friends, our families, as essential workers, as parents and neighbors and community members who have helped each other. We immigrants have brought this country forward during the hardest moments of this pandemic, and we continue to do so. Our families, our children can't move forward, can't prosper, cannot thrive without a path to citizenship and fundamental change to our immigration system. So where are we now in the fight for citizenship? And specifically, where are we now in Congress? The House has passed 2 critical bills with bipartisan support. The Dream and Promise Act, H.R. 6, which provides a path to citizenship to over 3 million immigrant youth and TPS holders, and the Farm Worker Modernization Act, H.R. 1537, which provides a path to citizenship for over 1 million undocumented farm workers and their families. So these bills have passed the House with bipartisan support. In addition, Senator Padilla and Representative Castro have introduced the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, which would provide a path to citizenship for approximately 5 million immigrants who worked as essential workers during the pandemic. And Senator Menendez and Representative Sanchez have introduced the U.S. Citizenship Act, also known as the Biden Day One bill, setting out a path to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented immigrants. Now, of course, these bills need 60 votes to pass the Senate, unless there is filibuster reform. But Democrats also have the opportunity to deliver for millions of immigrants and their families by including a path to citizenship in the Build Back Better Jobs and Infrastructure bill. There are ongoing bipartisan talks with Republicans about the infrastructure package, but there is reason to think that these negotiations are not being carried out in good faith. And Democrats are starting a parallel process of putting together a bill that would include top priorities, including immigration, as well as climate, healthcare, which they can pass through a legislative process known as reconciliation, which expedites certain budgetary legislation and only requires a simple majority, 50 votes plus 1 from the vice president. So as noted, the We Are Home campaign is committed to pushing for every opportunity using every legislative vehicle and executive action. That's why we were thrilled to see the news this week that Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders included a pathway to citizenship for a significant number of immigrants in his outline for his infrastructure bill. This is a major step. The reconciliation process can provide our best chance to move a path to citizenship forward. It is a process that has been used for major legislation, including healthcare reform and tax legislation. We are confident that immigration can and should be included in the reconciliation package. And in fact, in 2005, green card provisions were included in a Senate reconciliation bill. So we are urging all members of Congress to push for the inclusion of a pathway to citizenship for immigrants and their families in the next reconciliation package, including immigrant youth, DACA recipients, TPS holders, farm workers, and essential workers. At the same time, as we fight for a path to citizenship for immigrant families in Congress, we are urging the administration to undertake urgently needed reforms to the cruel and unjust enforcement system that continues to detain and deport immigrants with longstanding family and community ties in the United States. This is the year for us. We will not take no for an answer. Our leaders must meet the moment to re-energize our economy, go big to rebuild the cities and towns for the future, and modernize our immigration system to show us and the world that America can lead with ideas and values. It has been 35 years since we've had substantial policy solutions to protect and ensure the dignity of immigrant families. We believe we can get this done, but it will take all of us fighting very hard. But this is our moment. We are very thankful to be working with all of you and for your commitment to justice.
Thanks so much, Sonia, for illuminating the urgency and really the progress that we're making and what more there remains to be done. Robert, I'm going to turn to you for the next question with a focus that I think everyone has been aware of, which is the arrival of children and families at the border. What steps has the administration already taken to address harmful policies that have hurt children and families seeking safety at our southwest border? and what more needs to be done?
Sure. So thank you, Miriam, for your question, and thank you to the organizers of this great event. So before I address some of the specific policy changes the administration has made, I just want to take a second to recognize the significance of the administration's tone and rhetoric regarding immigrant children and families. We saw the detrimental effects of the prior administration's harmful language, and the Biden administration's more humanizing approach to children has been a welcome change, although that message has been more complicated in regards to adults. From President Biden to Vice President Harris, to key figures in important agencies throughout the administration, we've consistently heard a language that affirms the humanity of children, regardless of immigration status. And so we appreciate that change greatly. So there's been a number of changes in policy and practice made by the current administration to undo and rectify harms that were imposed on immigrant children and families. One of the administration's first significant steps was the formation of the Interagency Task Force on Family Reunifications. They were tasked with identifying and reunifying families separated by the Trump administration's callous zero tolerance policy that knowingly separated children from their parents. The task force is currently working with immigration advocates and the ACLU, who sued the government over family separation, to create a process to reunify families who remain separated and to ensure families' safe return to the United States. A number of parents who were sent back home under the Trump administration have returned, and that work will continue. Our biggest fight will be to ensure that every family who wants to receive permanent protection receives it due to these harms imposed, unfortunately, by our own government. The administration has also taken steps, including some recent developments, to address individuals impacted by the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy. More than 70,000 people were subjected to the program, and many were exposed to extortion, sexual assault, kidnapping, and inhospitable conditions. In February, the Biden administration began granting entry to immigrants forced to await a court date across the border in Mexico. To date, the administration has admitted more than 11,000 people who were subjected to the policy, the doing of which allowed many immigrants to reunite with their US-based family and children. And just yesterday, word came out that the administration will begin allowing individuals who received orders from sham court proceedings to reapply for protection here in the United States. The administration has also made some progress on rolling back the harmful impact of Title 42. That's the policy that blocks asylum seekers at the border on the supposed basis of the pandemic, despite continued objections from the CDC and the medical community as a whole. Children are not subject to that policy, which is critical for ensuring their legal right to seek protection at our border. But the policy continues to be applied to families and adults. And although the ACLU is working with the government to reach a settlement that would end the policy, we think it's deeply problematic that the Biden administration has continued to use a discriminatory policy created by the last administration that clearly flouts asylum law and provides which public health experts have said again and again has nothing to do with public health. And in recent days, there's been some news that the administration may be planning to extend that exemption to family units, and that's something that we would obviously welcome. The administration has also taken steps to receive and process children arriving at our borders in a more humane fashion. Frankly, they were left a system in disarray by the previous administration. They inherited a set of policies and practices that violated our laws and our values, and also imposed a heavy strain on our system's ability to process arrivals. And so we appreciate the administration's commitment to quickly moving children out of CBP custody, and in some cases expedite release to parents. But unfortunately, the alternative system they've created still isn't grounded in a children's rights approach. And in a moment, I'll comment on how this entire system really needs to change. And then quickly, there's been several other decisions made by the Biden administration that have benefited children and families. Those include the termination of the memorandum of agreement between the Department of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services that resulted in the arrest of potential sponsors for unaccompanied children in government custody. The recent decision by Attorney General Merrick Garland to overturn the Trump administration's rulings in the matters of AB and LEA. And those are decisions that will protect victims of domestic and gang violence and allow them to apply for asylum, and as well as the restoration and expansion of the Central American Minors Program. And so last Sunday, it marked the 6th month of the Biden presidency. So while there have been some strides made, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there's still work left to be done. So as the Biden administration continues to reopen the border to people seeking protection, it must embrace policies that keep families together, prevent family separation, and prioritize the best interest of children. Moreover, to ensure that we do not find ourselves in a moment where we're, again, relying on emergency facilities, the administration has to adopt reforms and provide answers to longstanding problems in our immigration system. So broadly, we at the Young Center, along with others, are fighting for changes that include the following. And those are an end of policies that lead to family separation, and that includes Title 42 in full. The right to apply for asylum at the border is ingrained in our laws. It's also ingrained in our principles as a country. And we should not be using the pandemic as an excuse to turn away people from violence and persecution and seeking protection. We'd also like to see an end to congregate care and the use of emergency intake facilities. So the Biden administration took over the Office of Refugee Resettlement as the administration began, when its capacity was nearly slashed in half by COVID-19 protocols. But the agency's surge of resources has focused on creating temporary structures while licensed beds continue to sit empty. And frankly, EIS facilities, they're not appropriate for children. They're an improvement over CBP custody because they're not staffed with law enforcement officials. However, conditions observed recently are not better, clearly better, significantly better for children's safety, health, or well-being across all sites. And so there are ways to address the gap between licensed beds and place children in appropriate licensed spaces, and we'd like to see the administration adopt those approaches. In the meantime, we'd like to see conditions improve at temporary emergency intake sites. So until they're closed, they should be required to meet standards required for influx facilities and provide privacy for children's safety, allow them privacy in their sleeping conditions. They should have all medical services that are recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. They should be provided with case management from the day of a child's arrival. They should have access to counsel and child advocate referrals and connection to legal and post-release services after their release. We'd also like to see expedited release to families. The administration should begin prioritizing the release of children to family members. And many children arrive to the border with a trusted and loving caregiver. At present, they are separated and the children are placed in ORR's custody. And so to ensure that children's rights to health, safety, and family unity are protected, the administration could create or could co-locate DHS and HHS staff at the border so that HHS can assess those relationships and, if confirmed, approve the child's release to the adult family member. They arrived at the border, and that obviously prevents family separation and also maintains key legal protections for children. And lastly, we'd like to see the administration reorient its approach at the border from a detention model to one that provides medical, legal, child advocate, and post-release services to children in their communities while they are with their families. Far too often, children's sponsors are held to unnecessarily stringent standards for release. We'd like to see the administration adopt policies to improve its ability to quickly reunify children with their families and connect them to needed services in their communities after release, rather than while they're in custody, obviously while still providing those services while they are in government custody. So these are a list of developments that we'd hope to see from the administration as they continue to hopefully continue their work in welcoming and supporting immigrant children and families.
Thanks so much for that, Robert. I just wanted to flag for participants that you can enter questions for our panelists at any time using the Q&A button. So if you have any questions for Sonia, Robert, or Shelby, please go ahead and submit them, and we'll get to them after Shelby to speak. So Shelby, I'll turn to you next. There have been several policies implemented in recent years that threaten immigrants and their families' access to healthcare and other critical benefits. And one example of those is the public charge rule. Can you tell us more about why this rule was so harmful to children and immigrant families, and what steps the administration has already taken to address the rule and what more can be done?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this amazing panel. I've learned so much from my fellow panelists already, and thank you. So stepping back and thinking about what public charge is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, public charge is part of the process that individuals go through when they're applying to either come to the US with an immigration status, or they might be in the US and they want to modify their status. So what this policy is seeking to do is to make sure that individuals who are being granted this type of status are going to be able to be independent and not going to be fully dependent on the government for all of their living, right? And this is the policy, quite frankly, a very discriminatory policy, but it's been in our books. It's a law that's been, been with us for 100 years or more, right? But the way that it's been implemented for many decades has been super focused on making sure that when somebody is going through this assessment, the immigration official is thinking about whether or not this is an individual who is going to likely be dependent on the government as a measure of having to receive cash assistance to meet their needs, to meet their day-to-day needs, right? And or sometimes also thinking about whether or not this is an individual who's likely to be fully subsidized, in terms of being able to having long-term health care services within an institution. So people who are in a nursing home, for example. So that is the universe of what an immigration official was looking at in the past, and for many, many decades, this was the way that this policy has been implemented. So when an individual would come, that's the universe that they were looking at. Under the past administration, almost in the very beginning of the administration, we began to see leaks in the media that the administration was planning on radically changing how that test was administered. There were rumors, early drafts that were leaked that made it so that it seemed that it was going to be extraordinarily vast. To give you an example of what that looked like, it made it sound like, even the receipt of benefits like Medicaid or the children's health insurance program of children of an individual who was going to go through an immigration test could potentially negatively impact that person. So you can imagine, I mean, in that, it was extraordinarily vast, and that began creating a tremendous amount of fear. And then when you build on top of that, we saw evidence that the administration was potentially seeking out a radical change in policy, right? And it was all happening within the context of extraordinarily harsh rhetoric against immigrants and their families, and a lot of negative other policies against immigrants and their families. So people believed that this is going to be as bad as it could possibly be, right? Then there was a rule that was, went through the process, and when it was finalized, it made it so that no longer was an immigration official going to be looking at that very narrow set of benefits, right? Cash assistance and long-term care at the government's expense, right? In an institution, but instead would be looking at an individual who was applying for an immigration status, whether or not they were likely at some point in time, not tomorrow, not immediately, not only past use, but some point in time, we're going to utilize programs like SNAP, Medicaid, housing assistance. And when we look at the universe of these programs, they're programs that a lot of people utilize in our nation. A huge number of people utilize these programs at some point in time in their lifetime. So we're talking about giving immigration officials an extraordinary amount of flexibility to be able to look at somebody and say, I think this person might one day have to access SNAP, right? So it really radically changed this test. But what else it did, which really it was very unfortunate, it also created a tremendous amount of confusion and fear among immigrants and their families that then began to think, well, wait a minute, we can't access any government supports because doing so may somehow risk one of our family members, one of our loved ones, from being able to achieve this very important immigration goal so that our families could stay together in the US, right? Or so that we could bring our family member into the US to be with us. So it created this cloud of fear, confusion that resulted in many individuals going without really critical services. So Kaiser, Urban, other entities have done surveys of individuals that clearly showed that that this fear resulted in action, and that action was to not enroll in benefit programs among many people, whether or not it was really going to potentially impact in a negative way whether or not they would be able to achieve an immigration status that they were seeking. So that's where we were. That's what happened. And that unfortunately continues to be a fear that exists across our country, and that is keeping individuals and families from getting the services that they need under this pandemic. We've been hearing nightmare stories, media after media accounts of individuals who are going without COVID-related services, including vaccination, including testing, including treatment. People are confused. They're not getting health services for their children, for their, for themselves. They're not accessing benefits like food assistance. So it's a very, very big concern. The administration, the Biden administration, took very swift and very decisive actions. And a couple of things that they did was that the public charge, the radical change to public charge rules had been under debate in different courts. And what the administration decided I'm going to make this very, I'm going to make it as simple as possible to explain because there's all sorts of moving parts. But basically, the administration decided to stop defending, this rule in the courts, and it also withdrew this rule altogether after the court said, okay, so the government's no longer going to be defending it. We're going to, put in place the injunction that previously existed. So made it so that the rule was no longer going to be implemented. And then the government said, well, we're going to withdraw this rule altogether. So the rule no longer is part of the Federal Register. It's no longer the policy, it's no longer the rule of the land. So that's great. So to your next point, right, is what happens next. And the government has begun taking some great steps in trying to encourage different benefit granting agencies to tell people about this, right? But boy, do we have a lot of work to do in this front, right? It's not going to be super easy, right? After years of media account after media account of this rule being, created and how bad it was going to be and all of this, there's this huge cloud of fear, and it's going to take concerted effort at all places in the government, and also all of us on this call today or on the Zoom thing today, right? And everybody out, everybody in the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, and everybody, it's going to take doctors, and it's going to take, food banks, and it's going to take churches and all sorts of organizations really shouting it from the rooftops. And it's going to have, these messages are going to have to come over and over again in languages that people, understand, and in using messages that are going to resonate with them, because we are going to have to break down a fear, right? It's not as simple as just saying, hey, come sign up for food stamp or for SNAP. It's not an awareness problem, it's a fear problem. So you're going to have to get at that fear. And it's going to take a tremendous amount of aggressive outreach to make that happen.
Thanks so much, Shelby. So we're having some questions coming in the chat, so I'll ask a few of them. One of them is, and I think this is more for you, Shelby, how do you reassure immigrants that the public charge rule will not change in the future and ultimately impact them?
That's a really great question. And I think one of our biggest recommendations that we've been making is that the government go through a rulemaking process, so that this rulemaking process, it goes to what the normal procedures normally are, where the public has a chance to offer comments to the rule and that the rules get modified. But because that is very difficult, I mean, not impossible, but difficult to change, right? And it really codifies the policies that that are in place right now. That's basically what we would like to see happen. The policies that are in effect now are the same policies I kind of talked about earlier. So codifying it in rules is the #1 thing that we think could happen, so that people can feel more secure that this is going to be policy that's going to stick around, and immigration attorneys will feel confident in understanding what this policy means and that it's going to stick around, and they understand that it's difficult for a new administration to come in and change something that's in rules, that's codified in rules. They would have to go through a very long, lengthy process to do something different.
Sonia, there's a question for you. You kind of hinted at this earlier, talking initially about congressional action, but there's also things that they can do that the president can do administratively, right? Like he's spoken about fortifying DACA, about changing enforcement priorities. What have they done so far administratively, and what more is the We Are Home campaign looking for the administration to do?
Miriam, yes, absolutely. The administration can do a lot to extend protections to immigrants while Congress is considering paths to citizenship, which must be established through legislation. So, this administration has taken some important steps with respect to the use of its executive authority. One program to highlight is the Temporary Protected Status Program, TPS. So these are protections that can be designated for the nationals of certain countries when it's unsafe because of a humanitarian disaster, natural disaster, other conditions in that country, to return people from that country to that country. It's a long-standing program that was passed by Congress, and it's the administration that designates different countries for TPS protection. This was a program that came under significant attack in the Trump administration. I think some of the President Trump's most notorious comments, anti-immigrant comments, were about countries designated under the TPS program. And after tremendous advocacy from many community members and leaders from the Haitian American community, the Biden administration earlier this year did redesignate Haiti for TPS in light of just increasing political instability and violence in that country, which would have made it unsafe for Haitian immigrants to be returned to that country, and made it really all the more urgent for Haitian immigrants who've been in the United States under the TPS program, but have faced this uncertainty due to attacks under the Trump administration, to be able to have some more certainty. It's not a path to citizenship, but some more certainty about the stability of their families, the ability to remain with their families and with their children in the United States. Currently, the administration is considering designating or redesignating TPS for a number of other countries, again, where conditions in those countries kind of warrant such designation. That includes Central American countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, as well as Guatemala. So that consideration is before the administration, and certainly from the campaign's perspective, we support sort of the full use of the president's authority under TPS and protections for people when it is unsafe for them to return to their home countries, including the Central American countries, including other countries such as Cameroon, Mauritania, Nepal, others. So that's one area that we are advocating around and watching closely where the administration can use sort of its executive authority to protect people and allow them to remain in the United States, even if not on a path to citizenship. Of course, I think many of us are waiting and watching for a court decision about the future of the DACA program, which has been under litigation for a while and is before a federal court in Texas, which is expected to rule any day on the future of the program. And so, that is something where we are committed to fight for DACA, which has had life-changing effects for hundreds and thousands of young people and their families. And, we want to see the administration continue to fight for DACA as well. Separately, when it comes to kind of the way the administration conducts immigration enforcement, this is also an area that is sort of under the administration's power. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas, has been clear that he is undertaking a sort of top to bottom review of the agency's enforcement policies and practices. We as a campaign, as a movement, are urging him in the process of this review to really seize the opportunity to transform the enforcement system, to reject the sort of cruelty, the injustice, the sort of impact of structural racism in the way enforcement has been carried out in this country, and to really center the needs of children and families, to center the interests of justice, to center humanitarian interests in the way that the agency conducts immigration enforcement, and to use the full power of its kind of prosecutorial discretion authority to keep families together, to keep immigrants in their communities. We know from the Trump administration, and I think thank you to the many researchers and advocates in this summit who have delved so deeply into the impacts of deportation on children and on families, the harm that it does to children to be separated from their parents, and the harms it does to community members as well. So, speaking to the kind of chilling effect that Shelby described, right? When community members see other community members detained, deported, that affects an entire community. It reduces trust and increases fear in accessing services and benefits that are needed. So all to say, this is an important time for advocacy with the administration, because it is in their power to change the way this country conducts enforcement, and to really prioritize the needs of our communities.
Thanks for that. Robert, I have a question for you. Children and families who come to our border are not arriving in a vacuum. There is something that is happening in their homes that make it unsafe for them to be there. So what can our government, and particularly the Biden administration, do to support children and families so they feel safe and like there's an opportunity for upward mobility in their home communities, and to create more pathways to come to the United States to be with their families?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question and important subject to discuss here. Unfortunately, so much of this conversation is had in a vacuum, where people who are acting often not in good faith like to act that people are children and families and individuals are coming here because of some kind of welcome, offer that, we send out as a country, or that, it's purely for, some kind of like economic rewards, although that can be part of it. But, it's important to clarify the reason why people and children, particularly in families, come to our country. They're facing natural disasters, they're facing persecution, corruption within their own governments, violence, and economic straits. And so, framing the conversation around those particular causes is important. I think the administration has taken some important steps to trying to address those problems, because until we do address those root causes of migration, as we really haven't yet, we'll continue to find ourselves in these recurring moments that we've been in. They've requested over $800 million in foreign assistance for Central America. That's part of a 4-year, $4 billion plan. And so that's, I think, a good step. But it's critically important that we continue to open up pathways to legal migration. I think the Central American Minors Program is an example of that. While there are components of the program that need strengthening from its previous version, that can be a step in the right direction. But we also need to continue to strengthen access to asylum at our borders, and affirm that children, families, individuals have a right to apply for asylum at our borders, while at the same time working to address those root causes of migration.
Thanks so much, Robert. And thanks to all three of you for telling us about the steps and progress that have already been made in this administration, and really the work that remains to be done to advocate for policies that help children of immigrants grow and thrive. And thanks to all of you who have joined us to watch, and please stick around for the next panel.
Thank you so much to our moderator and panelists. There's so much to be done at the federal level and so much opportunity for advocacy. And in these advocacy efforts, it's really community members and grassroots leaders, those folks who are directly impacted by these policies. It's really them who are leading the way in securing these changes you just heard about, which brings us to our next panel, focused on centering the voices of immigrant communities through lessons from grassroots leadership. So with that, with Natalie, Danny, and Freddie, please turn your cameras on as I introduce you. So our moderator today for this panel is Natalie Santamaria, who is a promotora and network manager for Visión y Compromiso, a California-based nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the health and well-being of underrepresented communities. Natalie is a promotora with a rich experience working in different communities and comprehends many of the challenges and barriers they face. She has broad experience working in the area of advocacy and special education, financial stability, immigration, mental health, and the overall well-being of the community. Next, I'd like to introduce panelist Danny Diaz, Director of Mobilizing at La Unión del Pueblo Entero, a Texas-based organization. Danny is a campaign strategist and organizer advancing the power of working families to harness policy to win transformative change. Born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley, he serves as Lupe's Director of Organizing, where he leads campaigns to win thriving neighborhoods and protect family unity. Finally, I'd like to introduce Freddie Lopez, the internal president of Undocumented, a student-led and student-run organization working to create a more inclusive environment for immigrants through education and advocacy. His leadership has contributed to institutionalized support of undocumented students at George Mason University, such as the establishment of an emergency fund for undocumented students during COVID-19, the implementation of a comprehensive and efficient domicile appeals process, and more. Natalie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you, everyone, again. Welcome today in this very, very important conversations that we're having. So as we've heard in the previous panel, there has been a lot of recent changes in the federal administration, especially around policy and immigration. As community-based organizations, we've had to switch gears very rapidly. When we had the the fear of public charge and all of that it took, it was several years of fighting, educating, re-educating our community, and sort of being a reactive front. We were being very proactive. We were fighting for immigration reform, right? DACA. We had the success of Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare, as a lot of us know it. And then again, we had to rapidly switch gears. With that, I think we've also played and learned a lot of lessons in being resilient. And we also had a lot of success. I will point again to the public charge rule that we were able to put a lot of hoops, the administration, and taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. Affordable Care Act that is still in place, and none of the now fully back in place. And we continue to fight for it to expand instead of cutting it off. And with that, I'd like to start with Freddie. What is the landscape? What has been the landscape when advocating for racial and economic justice? What have been the challenges and lessons learned when involving political and coalition participation?
Thank you for that question, Natalie. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think that when we're talking about racial and economic justice, especially after COVID-19, you see community organizers really starting to have those truthful conversations about what it will look like to achieve racial and economic justice. So you really are starting to look at kind of like different movements and community members trying to reimagine what inter-movement solidarity looks like and how to advocate for demands that uplift all of us instead of demands that might compromise members of some of our communities to get more benefits from members of other communities, or vice versa. So what I mean by that is I like to give the example of the immigrant rights movement, right? So if you look at it during the 2010s, they're like early 2010s, you really saw this big kind of like framework around the Dreamer narrative and the Dream Act, and kind of just portraying immigrants within this kind of like picture of immigrants deserve rights because they are workers, immigrants deserve rights because they, you know, have suffered this much and this much. But really now you're starting to, especially with DACA happening and with no like comprehensive immigration reform, you're starting to look at community advocates saying, okay, did we really paint the picture that we wanted to, right? Did we really kind of like paint the picture of the diversity of our community, or did we kind of just painted this like portrayed this model minority myth of immigrants specifically for young people? So you're starting to see this kind of like shift in conversations, especially saying like, okay, actually, no, right? We deserve rights because we have been in this country for this long, and we have contributed to this country outside of economic kind of like benefits, you know, and you're starting to look at kind of just community members really talk about the impacts that different people face because of different kind of identities that they have. So, you know, now you're starting to have the conversation of anti-Blackness within the immigrant movement, and how a lot of kind of the framework and the narrative that we use was built on this kind of like ableist and anti-Blackness lenses. And what we mean by that is kind of just saying, right, you know, for example, the whole worker narrative, really all that we're saying here by using that kind of narrative is saying, okay, we're only useful because of our bodies. We're only useful because we are able to work and contribute to society, right? And then by portraying this model minority myth, the anti-Blackness roots within the immigrant movement have really gone back to like really since the beginning of it. So really having these conversations is trying to learn how do we advocate for demands that uplift all of us, and really try to achieve this racial and economic justice that includes all of us, rather than trying to kind of just, you know, pick and knit kind of like what we want. And yeah, I can talk a little bit more about it, but that's kind of what I think is the overall.
Thank you, Freddie. And now, Danny, what are the challenges of describing what the on-the-ground situation is to external coalitions and political leaders? Being in a border community, what has the reality been, and what tools have you used to promote racial and economic justice within colonias and recently arrived immigrants? What has been the most present issue for the communities you work with?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Natalie, for the question. Thank you, everybody for having me here. I live in the Rio Grande Valley, so a lot of like my response here will be like based on like South Texas and the border. So the challenge, I would say, is how the national narrative, either from the media or from politicians themselves, have spun the issue of immigration on the border and have painted border communities as dangerous, high-risk criminal areas, essentially justifying like massive investment in militarization, like border walls, a mass detention of migrants, which we're seeing right now. Surveillance technology is being talked about as something that could replace border walls, which is still very troubling to us. More boots on the ground, like Border Patrol and DPS surges here in Texas. We know that as state police, Governor Abbott placing a massive amount of state police in border communities. But even under the Biden administration, we feel that the tone continues to be dominated by border security, while ignoring human rights violations that continue to happen today. So it constantly feels as if the border is being compromised in the immigrant debate. So yeah, you guys want to bring immigration reform and pathway to citizenship, but we got to give some politicians massive militarization at the border, right? Completely forgetting that like millions of people like myself and so many others live in border communities like Brownsville, Laredo, San Diego, El Paso, right? And while the stay in Mexico policy has officially ended, right? And we know that how troubling that was for border communities, we still now have Title 42 that continues to remove migrants who are illegally seeking asylum. So if you ever paid attention to the images of camps of people in Matamoros, Mexico, or Tijuana, you know, that's continuing to happen in cities like Reynosa, Mexico, like 10 miles south of where I'm at right now, where people that are being denied their case and being returned to Mexico are now in the middle of a city, Reynosa, that is one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico, making them very, very vulnerable to the situation there. right? All this while the real needs of South Texans, of millions of people on the border, we have real needs get shoved to the side. Needs like healthcare, neighborhood infrastructure, like good drainage, sewer, broadband, more specifically needed in the thousands of Colonia neighborhoods and communities across Texas border. So Colonia neighborhoods, unincorporated communities that got developed over the last 30, 40 years that lack basic services that resemble those of like neighboring country, like poor neighborhoods in neighboring countries, right, that exist here in South Texas. Nearly 1/3 of residents in the Rio Grande Valley here in South Texas, a border region which I reside in and organize in, do not count with any healthcare, and thousands more are underinsured, depending many times on community health clinics and health fairs that many times nonprofit organizations organize, but that lack the necessary resources for people that suffer from more serious conditions, right? It's just not enough. So hundreds of unincorporated neighborhoods, or colonias as are known, that we organize in, along with partner organizations, do not have sewer systems, do not have flood control drainage systems, do not have streetlights, and thousands live in substandard homes. These conditions make all of these communities very vulnerable to natural disasters that we've seen in the past, the recent past, with hurricanes or winter storm blackouts, as it hit Texas really bad, and it hit this community bad as well. So essentially, immigrants in border communities had to deal with a layer of challenges. Besides the massive border militarization and the fear and the threat of deportation, having to also live in areas that are completely ignored, that lack healthcare, that lack broadband during the pandemic, that lack access to public transportation, because a lot of the money and the investment goes to policing and militarization while ignoring a lot of like the actual real needs that most people have, and impacting not just obviously immigrants, but the entire community of first, second, third generation Latinx people that live here. So our strongest tool, I would say, is organizing and mobilizing our allies and partners. We are organizing, calling for our state and federal officials to welcome with dignity at the border, right? So a lot of asylum seekers are choosing the South Texas border as a point where they want to cross and seek asylum. And we want to make sure that our federal and state officials do everything they can to welcome with dignity. What does that look like at the border? This could look like investing in immigrant and refugee welcoming centers, welcoming migrants seeking asylum at the border with dignity and humanely, and not detaining them, which is far often what the government has been doing, in detaining people that are seeking asylum, which to us is a violation of human rights. The welcoming centers could be a hub to meet the needs for asylum seekers, from healthcare to legal assistance to simply assisting them in arriving to their final destination point in cities across the country. But not only are we having to sound the alarm to our federal leaders in Texas, most recently we have state leaders like Governor Abbott that actually are proposing to build border walls from the state level, which we don't even know that's legal, right? But pretty aggressive. He's been pretty aggressive in that, and criminally charging every single undocumented person that crosses the border, pushing for a minimum prison sentence of 6 to 12 months. This is what's been happening in the last few weeks here. This type of policy would essentially create another family separation crisis, because it would literally imprison adults. Governor Abbott has called on the support of border counties and county judges, sheriffs, and district attorneys to cooperate with this plan to criminally charge migrants and to expand local county prisons so they could fit migrants in there. So this was terrible, but also an organizing opportunity for us to pressure the local counties not to cooperate. So we organized at a local level, demanding our county judge, sheriffs, and district attorneys in different counties across the region to not cooperate with Governor Abbott's dangerous anti-immigrant, what we consider a family separation policy. So our organizing efforts as a tool have at least worked at the very local level, included mobilizing thousands to sign a petition to our local county judge, going to the local media and mobilizing hundreds of people to attend a local county meeting, going on open forum, urging county leaders not cooperate with Abbott's policy, anti-immigrant policy. It's worked so far. The 4 counties that make up the Rio Grande Valley and the border have come together to oppose Governor Abbott's plan after initially thinking about joining on. So we've seen the power that organizing has, especially at a very local level, to start organizing at least our local officials to fight back, right? Our local organizing efforts, because I talked about organizing and mobilizing being a very powerful tool here, is also we've been able to successfully negotiate for millions of dollars in drainage, streetlights, connected thousands of mixed status families that live in colonias to broadband and internet access during the pandemic with CARES Act money that got allocated to this county. And we're able to negotiate to make sure that that money was actually being spent at the local level with immigrant families, mixed status families that live in some of these neighborhoods. And economic justice plays a huge role in the work we do as well. As we know, border communities continually rank as some of the lowest income communities in the country. Part of this because immigrants are vulnerable to work exploitation. So we constantly work with members that are being threatened by their employers with Border Patrol, because we're surrounded by Border Patrol here. We constantly work, we've taken thousands of wage theft cases over the last decade, mostly of undocumented migrants or immigrants doing construction work, domestic work, farm workers, restaurant workers, the most essential workers, as proven during the pandemic. We already knew this, but as proven to the nation during the pandemic. And because of this, we now more than ever that we need comprehensive immigration reform that includes all 11 million people. Not only is it the right thing to do, right? But they literally gave life support to our economy as essential workers during this pandemic. So we are organizing, continuing to organize immigrant families across South Texas to push for all 11 million people in whatever way possible. If it has to happen through a reconciliation process, we would do that, in whatever form it comes, but we want to push for 11 million people. It's important to us, it's important to our families. And that's what it's looking like down here in the border.
And in the middle of that, you still have to work, play, eat, and sleep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danny.
Oh, we have a big team. We have a good team. It's not all me, but yeah.
Absolutely. We have our great community leaders and promotoras in the midst of it. And thinking of that and hearing you both, I think, one of the things that I find complexity, because as you heard, work with promotoras and organizations statewide. We have promotoras that are up at the north of California, and we have those at the border. And I think both of them, right, they face different issues when they're going out to the communities. And how do we, one, support them in the work that they're doing, right? Because we're talking with external coalitions and external political leaders, but I think we also need to remember that internally, we also face those issues of not understanding one another. Again, if I have a leader from San Francisco versus a leader in San Diego, it's very different. Although there are similarities, it's very, very different. So I would like us to share, both you, Freddie and Danny, what are some organizing strategies that we can share with audience members who would like to work with the communities to advocate for policy change at the state, local, and federal level, taking in consideration this, it is a national forum that we're talking to, and we have leaders in different parts of, the United States. And taking into consideration too, Texas versus California, very different political landscape. Whoever would like to go first.
Sure, I can go first. So our organization, something that we like to say is knowing when to take up space and knowing when to give space, especially when we try to work with the kind of those organizations and those community partners that, we might not understand or we might be advocating for, same goal, different strategies. We really try to bring in different stakeholders and knowing how to listen, but then knowing how to when we try to advocate for our demands, how to uplift our voices, and when we try to advocate for theirs, how to uplift their voices. So really trying to find this kind of common ground between when supporting different organizations and different movements, doing so in a way that is honest, but it's also in a way that is impactful, and knowing when we as an organization have our hands full at the moments, but then when we have the space to really provide that space to uplift all the community members and to really kind of do everything that we can to advance their agenda. And I think that, you know, having a diverse team and having a team that like focuses on many different areas is helpful as well, because, you know, we have some members that, you know, focuses on a very kind of like an advocating level at a state legislature level, right? So when we're trying to pass kind of like driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants here in Virginia, like our members who really had experience in that, we send them to those, and our members that had experience in kind of like more institutionalized and support at the university level, we send those members to lead those campaigns and to screen those progress management. So knowing what your team can help and how to use the strength of your team, but then also how to give that space to other community members, I think is really important.
So yeah, so plus one and everything Freddie said. I'm on board with everything you just said for sure. And maybe repeating some of the things Freddie said is from the perspective that from where I'm coming from, right? Like organizing in border communities. And I just mentioned how, you know, the narrative of border communities isn't really telling the true story. It's not truly highlighting people from the border. So one of our big pushes, especially through like comms and advocacy, is to seek help from national advocates or stakeholders at the national level to help uplift and scale the voices of people at the local level. So be incredibly helpful to scale the voices of regular advocates, residents, people living on the border to tell the true story, right? To challenge the narrative that this area is a lost cause, right? That this area deserves militarization, that it's an area that we could, you know, cut or chop for like political negotiations, throw under the bus, right? And that's not the case. We want to do the best possible to scale the movement of the voices of people who actually live on the border, and to uplift it, and to get the help of stakeholders, of people that might be in this call or other folks that you all know that could really grow this. Because I think Freddie mentioned it earlier in his initial comment, how in the immigrant movement, sometimes politicians are offering us immigration reform bills, but it's usually sacrificing one community for the other. And that's not what we want. Yeah, we feel that. I've heard it from even immigrants that have been here for 20 years, concerned about the migrants that are asylum seekers that are arriving this year, concerned that they're going to hurt their chances for immigration reform. So a lot of divisive language in our politics that we need to be really careful about. The same with obviously people in the immigrant rights movement saying that, yeah, let's go ahead and put border walls and put more border patrol and let's just get immigration reform happening while like millions of undocumented people live on the border under border militarization, right? So sticking together, right? Like staying disciplined and not, you know, chopping one for the other. I don't think is a solution here. I think we just need to like stay strong, and that's how we build. In organizing, building power is in building in numbers, right? So we allow ourselves to divide ourselves, like we're losing momentum or losing power. I think we need to stick together.
Thank you. And now I'd like to bring it back to Freddie. How do we involve youth in all of this, right? We've seen youth rising up, them being a lot more involved, but I also think that it's very important that we acknowledge that leadership, but we also understand it. One, because many of them are born here, first-time generation, so the issues they face are different. But we also have youth that arrived here early on, right? Very young or in their teen years. I was one that arrived here in my teen years. How do we do that? How do we involve youth in this advocacy efforts?
Thank you for that question. I you know, if you want sustainable solutions that will have long-lasting impact, you gotta involve youth. You gotta get their point of view, because really, when advocating for kind of just, especially in the immigration reform, kind of just, whether that is legislation, like campaigns, programs, whatever that it may be that you're advocating for, that if you want it to last, you gotta make sure that you include the generation that will be there when you leave. So, and I think with that's what best way to do that, and to give them the experience in leadership that you have, right? So bringing kind of youth into this movement, not just as people that tell their stories, not just as people that meet once a day with kind of like the head of your organization, but really putting them in positions and kind of like leadership positions specifically that teaches them how to advocate, that teaches them how to strategize, that teaches them how to, like talk to congressmen and congresswomen or congresspeople, like just different politicians, just really teaching them, okay, like when I'm gone, and if you want to carry the torch, this is how you do it. And in whatever way you can do that within your job, then do it. Because, especially within our organization, when you're a leader, it is your job to lead the organizations, but also your job to train the people that will come after you. And, young people are able to, I always say that, as time goes on, like people evolve, and at the same time, the systems and institutions evolve as well. So sometimes kind of the solutions that we implemented 10 years ago won't work for the people that come afterwards 20 years later. So, this is where young people come in and give their insights and say, okay, the system is not working for me, but this is how I think that it can work. And we're brilliant. Like there's just no other way around it. Is we're able to see those ways in which the system is broken and provide solutions that we know will work for ourselves, but also for people that will come after us. Like I was just talking to my sister the other day about mental health, and she was bringing things that I would have never even considered, just because the way that, my sister's generation is experiencing kind of like all these problems because of social media and whatever, like it's different than the way that I experienced it. And that was just a nice reminder of, okay, I gotta continue in order for this work to survive. I gotta continue to bring in people that are younger than me, but also working with people that are older than you, because having this intergenerational solidarity is the way that things get done, really.
Danny, if you'd like to chime in.
Oh, no, I think Freddie said it perfectly. I don't want to repeat stuff. I think he said it.
Thank you. And I saw there was a question lingering in the question and answer. I think it's important that we use terms that community members use in referring to themselves. And I think that this goes back to that youth question. We need to be inclusive. There are many that are used here in the US: Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx. Could you speak a bit more about how the community members you work with self-identify? I'll go with Danny and then Freddie.
So I'm sorry, I was trying to get like the core of that question. Can you repeat the
Yes. Could you speak a bit more about how the community members you work with self-identify?
Oh, okay. In terms of like within like Latinidad world.
Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx.
It's a lot of Latino, Mexican American, Tejano, South Texas. So it's interesting. We have third, fourth generation Tejanos in South Texas, but we also have people that just came across and very much identify with the part of Mexico that they're from. The Guanajuato, or it is a Monterrey, or from the north part of Mexico. Like there's different, like, it's interesting, the people that just came over. Plus, of course, we have a lot of people from Central America as well. So it's not always Latino or Latinx. It's always sometimes specifically talking about their specific region of the part of Mexico or from Central America that they're from, because 90% of South Texas is Latinx, right? And the vast majority are Mexican or Mexican American. So we hear a lot of that, Mexicano, some Latino, but mostly more like connected to like the Mexican heritage in this part of Texas.
Ready?
Yeah, pretty much what Danny mentioned, I think is, it's a hard question because, it's something hard to navigate, because the people use many different things when labeling themselves. For example, within our work, we work a lot with young undocumented immigrants who are in higher education. And some of them identify themselves as dreamers, while others really hate the term dreamer. So it's really kind of just letting them identify themselves and then just be respectful of that and using the language that they want us to use.
Thank you. Before we're getting towards the end of this panel discussion, but here's a question for you, Freddie. What is the work you do with New Deal for Youth?
Yeah, so New Deal for Youth is an initiative by the Center for Law and Social Policy, along with other partners, where they brought in young advocates for all across the nation, myself included. We were labeled as change makers, where we really would put it into conversations with one another, and we developed this kind of like set of demands of framework of what our vision is to reimagine what society for youth look like. And really, when we're speaking to politicians and anyone that may have kind of like power in creating change and saying like, in order for society for us to work moving forward, this is what we need. So we have different demands in, immigration justice. We have different demands in healing and well-being, demands in education and economic opportunities. So I'll drop, I don't know if I can, yes. So I'll drop the website in the chat and you can look there, kind of like the different demands that we come up with and how to get involved with our movement.
Thank you very much. And one last question, and I think something that we can all take away from this conversation. We are coming to an end, hopefully, of a pandemic year. Again, a lot of shifting gears, right? And realizing, and I think also honoring how our communities are resilient. Whatever it is that they throw at us, we get, we fall, dust it off, let's figure it out and continue to support our communities, but also go and face the challenges hand in hand with them. In the middle of that, again, of a pandemic and all these issues, what can we do? What can we do to continue to, one, either become an ally or help our leaders, promotoras, address these issues, whether we're in Virginia or we are at the border?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep discussion, a deep dialogue that I think a couple minutes, doesn't do it justice. But what can we do with promotoras, with organizers on the ground, right? What can we do? I mean, the biggest thing for me is to check in with folks. So right now we're doing we're lucky enough to get a grant to do outreach to over 100,000 households in South Texas. Just literally check in with people, provide resources, COVID resources, right? Checking who hasn't gotten vaccinated, who has, things like that. But also an opportunity to have conversations with people at the door. How are you doing? How did this year go? Are you back at work? Are you out? Are you vaccinated? A simple check-in could be a huge help, and having those resources for organizations, for promotoras, for more organizers to have the capacity to go have these individual dialogues with community members are a huge thing, go a long way. So that's where we're at right now with that.
Ready?
Yeah, what Danny mentioned about checking in is so important, because this is something that I had to learn the hard way too, is as an advocate, is you gotta do not what you think they need, but what they actually need. And in order for you to find that out, it's by having those check-ins and having those conversations with them. And wherever you are, I can guarantee you there's some organization, there's some grassroots advocates, like organization, whether that is youth-led or any other kind, that is doing the work in your area. So really just researching and sending a quick email and saying, hi, I'm this person, I have this position, what can I do to help you? I know that with our organization, our allies are key in doing anything. So for the we established an emergency fund specifically for undocumented students, and we're the only university in Virginia to do that. And the way that we did that was through having those like allies that use their positions to help us leverage like our influence and help us advocate in a way that we wouldn't have been able to just by meeting with faculty, just by meeting with other students. So really, if you can use the position that you are in any way and the power that you may have, whether that is little or big, to help this kind of like grassroots campaigns happening in your area, then just check in with them and ask them, how can I get involved?
Thank you, Freddie. Thank you, Danny. I love that you both touched on self-care and that importance of it, whether we're in the middle of a pandemic or not. That is very, very important. If you heard Danny at the very beginning when you were explaining all that we do, all that those organizers do, you know, I bring it back and same with you, Freddie, and with youth. It's very, very important. So I thank you both once again for joining me in this very important conversation. A lot also, you know, I agree with you, Danny, there's this discussion is for deeper dialogue, but I think we can continue that within our own allies, within our own coalitions, and within our own peers. And it is our hope that you do that. Please continue to join us for the rest of the day. There are 3 more panels, if I'm not mistaken, and we will also touch on mental health later on. So stick around, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you once again, Freddie and Danny.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Natalie, Freddie, and Danny. That was such a great panel and really an important reminder that all of the advocacy and public policies that we're pushing for should really be rooted in the experiences of impacted community members. So bringing the conversation back up a little bit to the state level, I'd now like to introduce our next panel that will highlight COVID-19 responses across states to support the recovery of immigrant families. So Juan, Emily, Rita, and Otto, if you could please turn your videos on as I introduce you. So I'll start by introducing the moderator of today's panel, Juan Carlos Gomez. Juan is a policy analyst for CLASP's Immigration and Immigrant Families team. He works with the rest of the team to uplift policies that support immigrant families, such as securing access to public benefits and ensuring that children in immigrant families have the support and resources necessary to succeed. Prior to joining CLASP, Juan was a legislative aide for Senator Cory Booker, working on immigration, healthcare, and workforce issues. On the panel is Emily Ruskin, Senior Policy Analyst at Unidos US, where she leads a research agenda in support of Unidos US's federal immigration advocacy. Prior to joining the organization, Emily served as a policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. She is a returned Peace Corps volunteer and holds an MPA from Princeton School of Policy and International Affairs. I'd also like to introduce Rita Medina, who is the State Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, CHIRLA, a California-based immigrant rights organization. With nearly a decade of experience in immigration policy and advocacy at all levels, Rita has worked on various budget items and advocacy campaigns to advance immigrant rights, including federal immigration reform, defense of DACA and DAPA, California's AB 60 immigrant driver's license legislation, and efforts to reduce and restrict funding for immigration enforcement. Finally, I'd like to introduce Otto Valenzuela, who is the Public Policy and Advocacy Manager at Hispanic Unity of Florida, an organization founded over 30 years ago to guide newcomers into the US on their journey to their American dream. Otto supports the policy and advocacy efforts centered around healthcare, education, immigration, and economic stability. Prior to joining Hispanic Unity of Florida, Otto worked as a community liaison at the Consulate General of Guatemala in Miami and New York and led a legal support team at Children's Attention Center. Juan, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you to everyone for tuning in and to our wonderful panelists for taking the time to speak on this really important issue today. So after over a year of enduring the COVID-19 pandemic, the US faces a long road to recovery. And while all families have endured hardships caused by COVID-19, immigrant families have been particularly hard hit. Immigrants were overrepresented among essential workers. 69% of all immigrant workers and 74% of all undocumented workers work in essential industries. But despite being overrepresented as essential workers, immigrants were largely remained ineligible for any federal support, and instead were often forced to work in conditions which endangered not only them, but their families as well. Inequities faced by immigrant families, such as barriers to healthcare, were also exacerbated during the pandemic. Many immigrant families are completely barred from accessing care through the ACA marketplace or through Medicaid and CHIP, and many others avoided care due to fear of immigration enforcement or their immigration status being impacted due to public charge. The lack of access to healthcare meant families went without seeking care during a pandemic. And immigrant families faced many issues beyond just being overrepresented in the workforce and lack of access to care. Immigrants were also disproportionately left unemployed for mass layoffs and faced struggles affording housing and food. Like many others, they had to adjust to online learning and also faced continued immigration enforcement and detention throughout the pandemic. The pandemic laid bare and worsened the myriad barriers immigrants and their families face to achieve good health, economic security, and quality education, among other needs. In order to successfully rebuild, we must urgently take action to meet the needs of immigrant families. So today we'll be hearing from 3 experts on what policies and actions have already taken place at the federal, state, and local level to provide relief to children of immigrants and their families during the pandemic, and what still needs to be done to ensure healing. So we'll start off with Emily. Emily, while immigrant families were largely excluded from federal support during the pandemic, there were a few instances that the federal government did include immigrant families. Can you speak to the pieces of federal legislation that explicitly helped children in immigrant families, as well as to what other policies were maybe less explicit, but allowed states the flexibility to help immigrant families? And can you speak a little bit more to what needs to still be done to assist immigrant families at the federal level? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Juan, for that question and the framing that you provided, excuse me, and to the organizers again for hosting this really important conversation, and my fellow panelists. As mentioned, I'm Emily. I'm a senior policy analyst at Unidos US, which is the largest Hispanic advocacy and civil rights organization in the nation. And so before we jump into a conversation about the pandemic and the government's response, I think it would be helpful to build a little bit more on Juan's really important framing for us to place today's conversation in a wider political and socioeconomic context. And so for those of you who might not have been able to join earlier this morning, as Wendy mentioned, children in immigrant families are overwhelmingly US citizens and a majority are Hispanic. They currently make up 1 in 4 kids in the US. And out of that population, nearly 6 million of them are living with a parent at risk of deportation. And so the reason that I want to start by recapping some of those stats is, one, for us to appreciate the size and the demographic importance of this population. It's literally an entire generation of kids. And 2, to reaffirm the reason that we're having this conversation today is that these kids and their families have been waiting a very, very long time for immigration relief. And so while the work happens on the immigration reform front and that fight, we must on a parallel track ensure that the safety net is working for all kids in the US. And so something else that's important to understand is how immigrant households were doing before the pandemic. And so as I mentioned, kids in immigrant families make up about 26% of the child population, but they make up 43% of all of the kids who are living in poverty in our country. And so I think that really helps to underscore how we treat kids in immigrant families is a core equity issue in US social policy. And one of the contributing factors to that inequity is the way in which we have increasingly excluded immigrants from social policy over the past few decades. And so with that said, I think it was definitely a disappointment, but not necessarily a surprise that immigrant families were left out of early pandemic relief. That treatment, it directly mirrors how immigrant families are regularly treated in social policy more broadly. So for example, I think most of the audience is probably familiar with the eligibility restrictions, which were placed on the first round of stimulus checks under the CARES Act, which is to say that if you were in a household with someone who files taxes without a social security number, you were cut out. And so all said and done, over 5 million citizens and green card holders were left out of this really critical support. And so people were rightfully outraged. I mean, it's so blatantly discriminatory. But what many people don't realize is that those restrictions on those stimulus checks were a mirror image of eligibility restrictions that already exist on existing programs. So for example, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of our most powerful anti-poverty tools, pretty much matches the stimulus checks. So, months of intense advocacy, those restrictions were gradually lifted in the December Omnibus and ARPA. And so while, I promise I will get to spots in relief bills that where eligibility was more inclusive, it's important for us to keep in mind that the underlying social policies that we're talking about have not changed with regard to how much they exclude immigrant families, the EITC included. So stimulus checks aside, there were some policies which allow flexibility in the relief bills. One of them is the Child Care and Development Block Grants. For those of you not familiar, it's kind of a small program, but still very important, which allows, it supports low-income parents to either work or go to school or get training, some kind of occupational training, and gives them subsidies for childcare. And that program only considers the child's immigration status. And so it's inclusive in that regard. The Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund provides emergency grants to higher ed students for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to COVID. So think things like food, housing, childcare, tech. And all said and done, that was about $76 billion in relief. But it wasn't until May of this year that the Department of Education lifted restrictions on that funding for institutions to be able to provide small grants to international and undocumented higher ed students. And that reversal was the reversal of an explicitly exclusionary policy under the DeVos Department of Education, and it only came after very intense advocacy. Another one that was more inclusive was the COVID emergency rental assistance, which was about $47 billion across all bills, and the sort of companion eviction moratorium that came from the CDC, which was universal and thus blanketly inclusive. And so this really was inclusionary in that eligibility rules were ambiguous as to whether or not this was cash assistance and thus limited under PERORA. So for example, a court ruled against Phoenix for discriminating against residents based on immigration status in December of last year, but that was only because they brought suit, right? So another thing to remember about these funds is that they are time limited and they are already starting to expire in some states as soon as next week in July. So I think what I'd really like to impart on people to take away from this is that, the pandemic was devastating and it was tough lessons for all of us. Most especially low-income immigrant communities. And so some help was arguably better than no help, but I want to encourage us to avoid the temptation of equating the absence of exclusionary policy as being the same thing as intentionally inclusionary policy. Because when we see things like the ambiguity of the restrictions, that really only helps at the local level if you have a friendly government that's willing to make the good faith effort to help all residents, regardless of their status, as the example was with housing. And even then, that's not a guarantee, right? So, the pandemic relief that mattered most, inclusion really came as an afterthought, only after a lot of advocacy, if at all. So what needs to be done? We are in a moment of opportunity, as was raised in the earlier panel on the Hill. And ultimately, what we need is meaningful immigration reform. But while we work on that, we do need to ensure that people are being taken care of and that the safety net is catching all kids. So in the immediate, really what we need is to make the gains from the American Rescue Plan permanent, especially the child tax credit expansions. But I think longer term, what we need to be thinking about is with policy design, at a minimum, we need to be respecting the rights of citizen kids and not devaluing their citizenship based on family status, which contradicts equal treatment, and quite frankly, it's punitive. So the example there would be the Earned Income Tax Credit. That really should be made available to Social Security number holding kids, regardless of how their parents file taxes. But if, you know, we really care about equity, which I think we all do, and that's why we're here today, we need to reframe our policy approach to center kids. If we want, if we value improved child outcomes, then, you know, kids should be the center. And so the eligibility should not be based on something that's completely out of their control. It needs to be based on their needs. And so the example there would be restoring the child tax credit for kids who are ITIN holders, so kids who don't have a social security number, as was the law before 2017 with the tax cuts. Something else would be nutrition aid. So we know that proper adequate nutrition is so critical to a child's development that really there's no justifiable restriction, and yet that still is the case under current federal law. So I'm happy to get into some policy implementation issues as well, or some accountability issues that could also help us to create a more inclusive policy regime. But I'm going to stop right there for now, because I really want to hear what my fellow panelists have to say, and I'm happy to talk more at the end if you have questions.
Thank you, Emily. And I think you bring up a really good point with the language around implicit inclusion. And with the federal government largely failing to have that implicit inclusion and meet the needs of immigrant families, many states had to step up and provide the critical support that families needed. So Rita, how did California respond to the pandemic? And what lessons were learned throughout the pandemic on relief implementation? And what still needs to be done at the state level?
Thank you, Juan. Thank you to everybody who's here with us today in our panel. Listening to you, Emily, I was trying to rethink what I was presenting, because I think that although I'm here in California, and California has this amazing reputation for being a leader on all things, you know, immigrant policy friendly, we too continue to face this challenge of historical exclusion from programs. And there needs to be so much work done to think about how we're not just writing policies with that explicit exclusionary piece, but really just thinking about the whole. There's no reason for us to be excluding folks, because as we know, as Emily stated, so many of our families, the US citizen children, are attached to mixed status families. And so, you know, one impact that we think we're going to have just on the parents is really affecting the whole household, including the children. And that's actually something that I think when I reflected and was preparing for this panel, I will just say that my particular lane of expertise is not necessarily in policies affecting children. But what was really clear to me as I was kind of doing a deep dive and reflecting on everything that California had done, it was that California's sort of solutions were, how do you provide some assistance to the families, right, to the parents, and then that would sort of trickle down into the households. And I want to start by just framing a little bit about what our state looks like in terms of our population and undocumented folks. So California was hugely hit by COVID. We had 3.7 million COVID cases, about 64,000 deaths. But if we take a really deep dive into those numbers, because we're a state with a large Latino population, and specifically when you zoom into our immigrant population and undocumented, it is also largely Latino. Latinos were completely just hit by this pandemic in what I think is sort of a perfect storm. You know, you have in California broadly, you're talking about Latinos being impacted by COVID in numbers that far outpace any of our other groups of ethnic minority communities, and also citizens who are, you know, white citizens in California. But then you also have folks who are undocumented who happen to be propping up our essential worker sectors. And so we're talking about, depending on where you are in California, everything from the folks who are putting food on our tables and farm workers who are not able to work from home and or in close proximity in the fields and had really difficult times getting access to testing, to benefits, you know, to vaccines once we were rolled around to vaccines. But then you're also looking at the population of folks who are in our urban centers. In big places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, where the undocumented populations there are workers in our service industries, our restaurants, they're domestic workers. And then if you zoom in even further there, you see that in California, and I think probably the trend across the nation, but since we're talking about California, we saw our undocumented women who were just so impacted by COVID because of the loss of either, as I mentioned, domestic worker jobs, having to drop out of the workforce in order to take care of children because kids were doing the Zoom homeschool. And it just, as a complete disruption to the family. If you are undocumented, you face triple, maybe quadruple sort of disruptions. And so, you know, with 1 in 10 workers in California being undocumented, I think that that's really sort of the baseline for where we started from. And there were already inequities in the system, as Emily pointed out, and I know as was mentioned this morning, and COVID, as we all know, sort of exacerbated that. And so I want to just get into a couple of ways that the state of California responded with assistance to COVID. And I will say 2 things. You know, one, as my cheerleader hat always, I will say that, you know, the governor of California and our state of California has made tremendous strides in providing support for immigrant families and specifically undocumented families. Prior to my role at CHIRLA, I actually worked in the state legislature, and it was partly during COVID. And so I think it was really interesting, and I'll touch on that in a minute, to see this piece about exclusion become a question where the language is ambiguous. You also saw legislators, you saw local, state, county and city folks looking at that language and saying, well, if it's ambiguous, can I or can't I? And you really were relying on the good nature of, you know, mayors whose heart were in the right place, county supervisors who had a really pro-immigrant policy lean. And I think that that's also something to take into consideration. Again, if we're not being specific, and if that specificity isn't towards the inclusion, there can also be some issues there. But one of the programs that the state of California rolled out was the Disaster Relief Assistance for Immigrants. It's shorthand DRE. So this was a $75 million pot of money that was both state money and private funding money that came together, and it provided $500 payments for folks. And so in a household, you could max out at $1,000. But, you know, there's a couple things about the program. One, it was obviously very welcome. The need was there. CHIRLA's phone lines crashed. I think you might have seen, if you were looking at California papers, that you just had millions of folks calling in, wanting to know when they could get the money, how they could get the money. And it was just, there was the obvious need that just overwhelmed the phone lines of all the organizations. There were 12 organizations who were tasked with distributing these funds. It was a self-attestation where folks just had to say who they were, where they lived, that they were undocumented and impacted by COVID, and they received these funds. But I think there's a couple things to note about this program. One, it was a one-time program. And 2, it distributed 150,000 of these cards. And our undocumented population in California is over 2 million folks. And so if you do the math, you're largely leaving out a lot of families who needed help with rental assistance, food assistance, et cetera. And when CHIRLA looked back at who was able to obtain these funds, and again, a lot of these were moms, women coming to CHIRLA asking for assistance for their families, the majority of the money was spent on rental assistance and food assistance. And so I think that that's just something for us to keep in mind in terms of when the one-time dollars are coming, what are they being used for? There were also efforts to look at who was on our roster for CalFresh, Medi-Cal, and send out cards. So these were food cards that were sent out to folks throughout California for children who were enrolled in these programs, free and reduced lunch. And this program came in 2 phases. So the first phase, that was really helpful. If you were on the roster, families received these cards and they could use them, and there had to be education about that this was not related to public charge. I think this is an important piece when we're talking about the benefits. There were still a lot of questions from families calling into CHIRLA saying, if I accept this benefit, if I go to my food bank for help, because we're in the Trump administration, am I a public charge? Is that going to affect my immigration status or my family's immigration status in the future? And I think that's another critical underlying piece of all of this help is you can create it, but will people access it if they are not sure how it's going to impact them in the future? But the second part of this card program that I think it's important to note too, is also that the second piece of this required families to actually apply for the program. And this goes back to the public charge. I just want to say a couple quick things about lessons learned, and I want to leave space for questions. And I touched on the local programs as well. You know, we saw cities like San Francisco and LA create funds that were, again, public-private partnerships to have wage replacement for families who desperately needed it, who lost their jobs during COVID. And I think that that really highlighted the importance of having these state partnerships with private funders as we work for a more holistic solution to getting resources to our folks. But I think that there's a couple other things too. One, we definitely saw the fears of the Trump administration stoked throughout their time really take root in the pandemic. Again, as I've noted on people questioning whether or not they could access programs. And I think that the other thing too is that we need deep investments in our safety net, even in a state like California. And it's not just, you know, how do we piecemeal include people into programs, but what are we doing to just say explicitly that all of these programs, regardless of the benefit, are open to you no matter what's the status. And I think that that's a muscle that we're going to have to continue to get our leaders to think about using when they're crafting policies to make sure that we're not seeing the exclusionary language. And then the final thing that I just want to say about a lesson learned is that Shirla has been working for years and years on trying to create an Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs at the state level. I know some states already have this, and it was not more clear than during COVID that we really needed a state entity to provide solid information, answer phone lines, coordinate amongst departments to make sure that whatever programs and benefits were being created, that they were all created with an immigrant inclusion lens, that there was education, proper language access, so that people felt comfortable or felt like they at least could open a web page, get some basic information, and follow up with an organization that they trusted. So I know that was probably a lot of pieces. I'm happy to answer questions, but I think at the end of the day, even in a state like California that is incredibly progressive and has a lot of really great policies as a baseline, we still have a long way to go to make sure that our folks are feeling like they have access and actually do have access to all the things that they need to thrive as a family.
Thank you, Rita. And you bring up a good point in that there are states that are more progressive, like you said, but still not doing, there's still more steps needed to be done to be inclusionary. And in other cases, there's immigrants living who are both excluded from federal relief and also face restrictive and harmful state policies that where the state and local government is actually targeting immigrant families pretty explicitly. Otto, can you speak a little bit to how community-based organizations fill in the gaps for immigrant families in those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. Juan, good afternoon, everyone, or morning. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting this on and for inviting us. As Gabriela said before, my name is Otto Valenzuela. I am Public Policy and Advocacy Manager at Hispanic Unity of Florida. We're a community nonprofit based in Hollywood, Florida. And I'll start off by saying our mission is to empower immigrants and others to become self-sufficient, productive, and civically engaged. To that point, and to what Juan and what Rita just mentioned, in some states in Florida, unfortunately, during the pandemic, a lot of people, regardless of immigration status, age, et cetera, fell through the safety net. There were some shortcomings that really affected wide swaths of the population, and community organizations like ours and related groups. We feel we were the first to realize what the needs within our communities were when the pandemic started a year ago, and where government could be most efficient in responding to the pandemic. The most pressing and immediate needs were health, including access to information in Spanish and other languages, access to testing, access to healthcare, housing because of evictions, and lack of moratoriums at the very beginning, and also food access. These three areas, health, housing, food access, were our focus and remain our focus to this day, because the truth is the pandemic really isn't over for millions of families. Hispanic Unity, also known as HUF, like many nonprofits, turn to the private sector and specifically foundations to fill in the gaps within weeks of the lockdown, we began to fill in these gaps by assisting our clients with emergency financial assistance to help cover essentials such as food, housing, utilities. We were able to distribute more than $225,000 provided by private relief funds that HUF applied for and administered. We also provided assistance with SNAP, Medicaid applications, and most telling of all in Florida, navigating its reemployment assistance program or unemployment benefits that unfortunately did not step up when the state needed it the most. And we also held food drives for our families and other programs just to meet the immediate needs. But aside from the assistance provided by our programs, we also address these immediate needs through the collective advocacy of our elected officials at the state and federal levels. We saw the pandemic as an opportunity to shed some light on and hopefully address, we still have this hope, address many of the longstanding issues that for years our immigrant families have been living through. On the policy front, we identified as impacting immigrant families the most were evictions or the threat of evictions. We reached out to legislators and the governor's office to continue to extend eviction moratoriums. We also worked on food access and facilitating food stamp applications by speaking directly to the state agencies, Department of Children and Families in Florida, to voice the concerns we saw within our community and advocating for change at that level. On the national level, and Emily spoke to this in her portion, were the numerous aid packages that were passed last year, but millions of immigrant families were left out. We, along with numerous coalitions, tried to address this because we knew, and again, Emily spoke very, very well to it, we just knew the impact that would have on families, particularly children, if they were left out and excluded from these packages. We, along with other organizations, met with staff from one of our senator's office and explained the harm and the unequal response that leaving out millions of families would produce, sharing client stories, highlighting the harm that was already being lived in early on in the pandemic. Along with meetings, we wrote letters to elected officials. We were named a contributor in an op-ed to the Miami Herald, calling for relief for immigrant groups. And eventually both of Florida senators sponsored or co-sponsored bills that address mixed status families in subsequent relief packages. We also advocated for the continuing needs of our community at the state level before and during Florida's 2021 legislative session by meeting with and presenting to our local elected officials our policy agenda. We crafted a two-part agenda with the help of coalitions and also community partners and input from the community, which focused on the short-term COVID needs. And a second agenda was made up of long-term policy issues, which impact not only the immigrant families that we serve, but really all Florida families. During COVID-19 and moving forward, we're going to continue to work on the expansion of Medicaid. Florida is one of 12 remaining states that has not expanded health coverage. And we have more than 1 million uninsured individuals. HUF also leads a coalition named the Children of Immigrant Families Coalition, a group of regional partners with expertise in healthcare, education, immigration, and economic sustainability. This group also brought together its collective expertise to present a policy agenda to Florida state officials. And I say all of this, one, to point out that we're a community organization, which policy is not our expertise. But as I previously mentioned, we saw the pandemic as an opportunity to try to respond to our communities and the immigrant families we serve. And thanks to the help of coalition partners, including Emily and Unidos US on the national level, and also their Florida policy team, amongst many others that stepped up. We tried and continue to try to give a response to the millions of families that need it here in Florida.
Thank you so much. And I know we're a little short on time, but I'll ask one brief question. So just as things begin to open up to full capacity, obviously we saw the many gaps in needs that immigrant families faced during the pandemic. What are, and I know there's so many issues and we spoke to how holistic the needs are, but maybe one thing that must be done to ensure that immigrant families are included as we begin returning to full capacity and begin healing. And maybe we can start with Emily.
Sure, thanks, Juan. I think really, as I was saying earlier, if we want an inclusive recovery, if we want an even recovery, a lasting recovery, that's not going to sort of perpetuate these cycles, then we really need to be thinking about what are the needs of children when we're designing and implementing child-focused programs. I mean, quite simply, we can't be leaving out some kids when the goal is to, lift up all kids. And so I think we're getting towards that with the child tax credit. If we can reinstate that, the I-10 kids who were previously eligible under a previous law, I think that would be a great place to start, because if under the expanded version, it really is going to be critical in reducing child poverty, which, flows over into so many other things lifelong.
Thank you.
I'm going to assume I'm next, just the order of operations here. I agree with everything Emily said. I think that to add just something a little bit different from the state perspective, if we want to work towards not just the recovery, but the additional pieces of trying to make sure that families have access to everything, it's the work to continue to do, program by program. That's what we say at Chair Level. We'll go program by program to make sure that folks have access to the things that they need in order to survive, thrive, and in this case, recover. And I just want to say two quick things about what's actually moving right now in California. So in 2020, there was a law passed to allow for I-10 filers to get the EITC expansion. And so that's going to help about 500, 600,000 folks who are filing taxes in the future. And we also have on our governor's desk, I think because of COVID and all the impacts in our budget this year, an expansion for Medi-Cal for seniors. And so we are really anxiously awaiting a signature on that, because that's the other piece of this, is making sure the access part. And we will have a large population of folks here, elderly folks in California covered if that is signed.
And I'll just wrap up really quick by saying perhaps two things need to be done. One, continued outreach to the families who need it most. The pandemic will affect them much longer than many others. So continued outreach, one. And two, elevate their voices and their stories to policymakers who many times are not aware of the hardships that their constituents live through, regardless of their immigration status.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Emily, Rita, and Otto, for all of your work in the space and for taking the time today to discuss all of the important work that still needs to be done to make sure immigrant families can heal from the pandemic. And thank you again for everyone for tuning in. And please stick around for our next panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Juan, Emily, Rita, and Otto again for such a fantastic panel. Next, I'd like to introduce our panel that will be focused on health and mental health, finding a path to healing for immigrant families. So at this time, I'd like to invite Adriana, Sarah, and Isha to turn their cameras on as I introduce you. The moderator for this panel is Adriana Gutierrez, who is currently the Director of Counseling at Yes to Youth, Montgomery County Youth Services. Adriana has over 15 years of experience in counseling in private practice, nonprofit, and for-profit organizations, including working with immigrant youth. I'd also like to introduce panelist Sarah Howell, who is the school social worker at Las Americas Newcomer School in Houston. She also manages the social work department at Houston Revision and is the founder of STAR, Survivors of Torture, Asylees, and Refugees, Counseling and Consultation and STAR Support, a nonprofit. Finally, I'd like to introduce Isha Weerasinghe, Senior Policy Analyst in CLASP's youth team. She focuses on mental and behavioral health impacts on communities living with low incomes, particularly for people of color. She led CLASP's technical assistance work in mental health for youth and young adults and mothers over the past 3 years, co-leading maternal mental health technical assistance with 2 states, and leading the efforts of CLASP's Mental Health Advisory Board. Adriana, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. And I just want to say hi to the panelists, especially to Sarah, who I've worked with before, and so it's really good to see you here. So I wanted to just start, our focus today is going to be on mental health and immigrant children, in particular, children and families. And so I wanted to just start in setting the tone of the needs of immigrant children. And so part of the research that my team from Robert Wood Johnson has done in working with immigrant families is we have found that the families need everything, right? So it's not just mental health needs, it's medical needs, legal needs. So their needs are vast. And we also know that families, especially the children, experience lots of trauma. And that's the primary reason why they're fleeing their home countries and why they're coming to the US. And so we understand that their mental health needs are vast. We also understand, though, that their social needs are vast as well. And so that's sort of the framework that we work with when we come across immigrant families. So what I'd like to do today is just kind of approach some questions to the panel, to our panel members. And I'd like to hear both sides and kind of get each of you your opinion on each of these questions, and we'll kind of bounce off each other that way. So the first question in regards to mental health and working with immigrants is, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on trauma-informed care and how important that is in working with immigrant communities. So maybe let's start with Sarah.
So for me, and in my experience, trauma-informed care means being aware of the impact of trauma, how it impacts when individuals seek services, seek support, how they perceive barriers, or maybe what feel like barriers to them, what could be re-traumatizing, what could be overwhelming, and just really what effect intersecting with individuals and systems have when you've experienced trauma. And I'm seeing a huge impact right now as my campus has worked really hard, not far from perfection, but worked hard on becoming trauma informed as I'm watching some of our newcomer kids move on to their home campuses. And they haven't put quite the same, they're building in the same priority, but it isn't there quite yet. And it really looks like not having the same sense of safety and encouraging help-seeking behaviors the same way. So not finding the same stability when it's not there. Mm-hmm. Finding a safe space that understands how trauma could impact and doesn't use trauma as an excuse to lower standards, but simply adapt things so that someone who's experienced traumatic events can still be successful.
And so, Isha, what are your thoughts on trauma-informed care?
Thanks, Adriana, and thanks for allowing me to be part of this panel and the summit. In terms of trauma-informed care, of course, that phrase, I think, our term is being thrown around a lot, and it has many definitions. And I think I agree with Sarah that it basically means meeting the needs of communities that you're trying to serve and being aware of what kinds of trauma the communities that you work with have experienced, and really trying to focus, like Sarah said, on what approaches are necessary, whether it's care coordination or team-based approaches to make sure that people feel supported. And ideally, you want to make sure that the practitioners or people working with immigrant communities aren't only trauma informed, but they're trauma responsive, and they work towards engagement that works for communities. And I think what's also really important when thinking about trauma informed care is not only to focus on assessments like whether you're thinking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, but also thinking about, to your intro, the systems that are at play. So thinking about ACEs, like thinking about divorce, abuse, family separation, financial stress, history of mental illness, but also those factors like community violence, food insecurity, fear of deportation, and racism and discrimination. And with the trauma responsive approaches to make sure that cultural healing is a part of that too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think that when we also add then the layer of the pandemic onto everything that they've experienced and the struggle it is for them to seek services anyways, and then we add this pandemic, it exacerbates the situation for them, and it increases the level of trauma and stress in the home. So what are some specific mental health needs or concerns in immigrant communities that you have seen? And so we'll work our way backwards. We'll go with Isha first.
So we've seen a lot. To your point, absolutely, COVID-19 has exacerbated existing mental health concerns for everybody. But when you're thinking about immigrant populations, and it's led to increased stress and worry. And then you add policies that have been really detrimental to immigrant populations, and then fear of being able to go outside your home, and then anti-Asian violence. All these things have led to increased stress and worry, whether it's generalized anxiety disorder, particularly in children, major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. I know that everybody's been talking about having insomnia, and when you think about the impacts on kids, it's really significant. Mm-hmm. There's also, when thinking about immigrant populations and specific mental health needs, different racial and ethnic populations, of course, have different perceptions of mental health. What is mental health, and what is mental health care? One study that I looked at noted that Asian Americans, for example, which could be the case for many populations, underutilize mental health care and treatment because of stigma, which exists in many communities of color. Also, because of perceptions on how care is provided in the West, and there could be misinterpretations of mental health concerns, whether a concern is actually a concern or not. Of course, you have to think about language barriers for those who are limited English proficient, making sure that your practitioners speak in language, and in many places that is not the case, and that they're culturally responsive. And then the larger issues, of course, are barriers and cost to afford treatment. And then for those who are lawfully permanent residents who have been here less than 5 years, who aren't able to access Medicaid, and then Medicaid is a huge access point for mental health care. And if you can't access Medicaid, what are you able to do? And then re-traumatization of what is being experienced in when people come to the US, of what was experienced in their home countries in terms of journeys to get here, which cause an incredible amount of stress and can cause physical and mental harm. And then the last thing I'll just note is the importance of recognizing intergenerational trauma. My family comes from Sri Lanka, and went through a 30-year civil war. And for my cousins who have immigrated to this country, I've heard stories of them seeing bodies being burnt, people being scalped, like the fear of being bombed, going to school, and that you carry that with you, and you carry that across generations. So how do you address that as well when you're trying to seek care, or when you're a practitioner? How do you recognize the impacts of trauma?
Thank you. Yeah, I think definitely. And in my field right now, I work primarily with youth, and we have seen a huge increase in increase of anxiety, depression, and the population that I see is both immigrant families and non-immigrant families. So, but I see it across the board. All these families are experiencing just higher levels of trauma. And then when you add the intergenerational trauma, and I think you see that in all families as well, right? It definitely adds an additional layer. One of the things that I've also noted, and just kind of adding to what you were saying, is the lack of access. One of the things that we have found is there's mental health hospitals for like severe hospitalization, and then there's counseling centers where I work, but we need something in between that, like there really isn't places for kids or families to go, maybe post-hospitalization. So like an outpatient program that doesn't cost thousands and thousands of dollars, that's covered by insurance. I think that's a big piece that is missing in care.
And just to add to that, also that people feel supported, that they don't feel like they need to go when something's wrong, or they feel that something's wrong.
Yeah. So Sarah, I'll pass it on to you. What are your thoughts on the needs of mental health for immigrant families?
So working in the school and with the juvenile justice kiddos, I'm really noticing I can stabilize to a certain extent with the kids that I'm seeing day to day, but the parents need so much support and stabilization, or the guard, let's say whoever the sponsor, guardian, whoever they're living with. And so many of the therapeutic techniques, accessing those services, they're successful when the parents the adult in the life is able to learn some of the skills, support the kids through it. And our parents are in a crisis state. And so I think I'm seeing a tremendous amount of post-traumatic symptoms of a lot of complex trauma that I think a lot of places and many clinicians are not super ready at all times to treat. We're prepared to treat trauma, but are we prepared to treat the level of complexity that a lot of immigrant families are coming with because of all of the historical trauma, the racial trauma that's the trauma they're encountering or continuing to encounter in systems. And each step along, when I'm seeing the newest kids that are coming, it wasn't just crossing the border, it wasn't just time in detention, it was after the release and then being bullied at school and on and on and on. And so it's being able to notice all of the roles that those things play. And then I'm seeing a lot of, you don't hit the criteria for PTSD. It's not quite acute stress disorder. So it's this ick and everything's labeled adjustment disorder, and it makes me want to pull my hair out because it's not. So what do you do with it other than hold a space for it? There's not good timing for treatment a lot of the times because we can, at the newcomer school, we can set you up with counseling, but maybe you're not ready for it. Maybe we're just trying to get you calm and stable, but it's not accessible after that. And it takes the same kiddo I talked to somebody about this morning. Said yes, he needs mental health, but it's a Guatemalan family. He's new to joining the family in the United States. Mom's been here longer, and it took months for him to start telling me what was actually going on. So he'll show up, but it's not ready to crack the surface. So it's that timeline, the accessibility, the financial, the cultural stigma about accessing, the family's commitment to taking somebody in, because I hear a lot of, we've all had trauma, we've all experienced it. So that psychoeducation to the family and the long-term impacts. And then giving the parents the support. And of course, with the pandemic, I absolutely agree, increases in anxiety, increases in depression, and a lot of things that are social anxiety that are coming out in my private practice. I have a lot of second generation immigrants or even first generation, but been here a long time, not newcomer. And the level of anxiety following, this is the first time people are venturing out in public spaces after the protests last summer. And so trying to navigate what that feels like if they feel welcome taking off their masks. So it's just become a really complex ick. And the other part that's frustrating me, I guess, kind of follows up the trauma-informed care question into this one, is that we name it trauma, we know that there's mental health needed, and then what? And so it's like we've reached the point where we're acknowledging it exists, but over and over, I'm hearing from staff members as well, we've all got it, live with it, instead of, we've got it, now let's support it. The awareness is raised, but the solutions aren't. And so we need to start moving past the responsive component that you mentioned. It's complex and harder than I thought when I was younger.
It definitely is. And there isn't sort of this one solution, right? Each family has, I think that's the other thing that we found in our research is that every family has their complex needs, right? And so one approach for one family and their needs is very different for a different family. And so when you approach mental health in that, it makes it even harder, right? When you're looking at then the piece of mental health. So yeah. So I'd like to maybe think about the parents here. I know this is about children, but I do think that parents play a key role in the success of the child and that family. I'm a kind of a family systems approach in my counseling. And so what are your thoughts on ways that we can help the children through the parents, specifically with their mental health? So maybe policies or even behavioral treatments that you think might be helpful. And we'll start with Sarah, kind of going back and forth.
So those of you, if anybody knows me, they know I'm hands-on. I want to be out. I make pan de coco with the families. We're making fish. We're bringing pollo campero. I'm sitting down on the ground. I think that's where it needs to start. And knowing that you're a safe person who has the best interest in mind and builds a relationship, bringing the service to the community, not asking you to come through all of these complicated processes. A new family arrived yesterday from Nicaragua. The little boy is Guatemalan. And I hated saying, follow up and call the county, the county mental health to see if we can start getting into the system, because it said you're going to get 3 different phone calls and she's going to be so confused. She was just released from detention. There's no way this is going to make sense to her if she calls because she's scared in the first place. Also, I'm seeing families try to hush kids sometimes who say, I need help. And they say, no, that's not going to make you a good immigrant. That's going to make you look like you're bringing problems instead of completely stand on your own 2 feet. So a lot of psychoeducation. But I think the only way that's going to happen is by showing up where they're at and being, I won't say welcomed per se, but making relationships so at least you're considered someone allowed into the community. You're not, I'm always going to be an outsider, but at least they know I'm the gringa that shows up at family parties. So just
you're safe.
I'm safe and that I have your best interest in it. That's the big thing, that knowing that it's not for, and explaining that I understand this is different from how you were raised in your country. I understand this is a different narrative, but look at the outcomes if we don't, and look at the challenges you're already having, because it's making you miss more work. It's making you, I want you to be able to have a successful time at work and move, be prosperous, and having to pick up your kid, having to go to the hospital, that's missing work hours. So how can I band together and help you with it and know that I'm safe and good intentioned.
Thank you. Isha, what are your thoughts?
So I think in order to support providers like Sarah, who are able to create those safe spaces from a policy perspective, we've been talking about this a lot at CLASP and with the administration, is to try to think about how can funding go directly to communities? How can funding not go through the middle person and have all these strings attached, and go directly to the places that are creating safe spaces for communities, without having all of these evaluation metrics and X, Y, and Z reports, all the things that are really a hindrance. And that involves making sure that there is trust in communities and trust in people with lived experience. And so in order for that to make that happen, there also has to be avenues for these policymakers to listen to people with lived experience as well. So I think all of those things, and your question was about parents, but it's all about creating those safe spaces, as Sarah was saying, and those safe spaces are going to be created in systems. They're already there, but it's just like how can they be better funded and supported through federal funding or state funding, and there needs to be more trust placed in those programs.
Yeah, I think funding is crucial, right? I mean, I think that we could train, like Sarah could train, 20 social workers to do what she does, but the funding, right, to hire 20 social workers isn't there. And it's definitely needed in the community, in all communities.
There's also this conflict of time that I keep running into, that funders want things accomplished in a certain amount of time. We are models for, we know that change takes time, but a lot of our therapeutic models say 8 sessions, 12 sessions, come on, move right through it. And that's not how healing always takes place. And so, I mean, it's a complex, everything's at play, but accepting that change might not happen as rapidly as we want, and that building in time to allow a safe space to be formed is a big portion of it. And it looks different ways across different cultures and in different locations.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Sarah, that then these funders need to look less at these quantitative metrics and more at stories, how people have been affected by the programs that you're providing. That's, like you said, change takes time, and behavior change takes time.
One, I think when we talk about intergenerational trauma, that you're not going to resolve that in 6 sessions, right?
I will never understand what has taken years to occur. I mean, when we're looking at complex trauma, also we're looking at over and over and over again. And all of a sudden I think, and this is my fight with teachers, but I talked to them nicely today. I pulled them closer this one time, but the probation officer goes out and meets and is a nice guy, or the police officer had a nice interaction. That's one. And now you need to do it every single day for the next 4 years to start setting that it's stability, it's consistency, it's showing up when it's wet and rainy and hot and cold and all of it. And it's the time over and improving the willingness.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, research shows that what heals trauma is that safe, consistent connection and the structure. And so that's the systems that we need to build in order to heal trauma. And you can't do that in 6 sessions, right? And so, so we need to write policies, I guess, to help us extend that a little. Yeah. So kind of thinking about policies, and so how policies such as the public charge rule from February 2020 impacted the mental health of immigrant communities? Is this something that you have seen in the families that you're working with? We'll start with Isha on this one.
So CLASP has done a lot of work on the public charge rule, and it's no surprise to anyone that it absolutely instilled fear in immigrant communities. And that I mentioned earlier that some immigrant populations were scared to walk out of the door because of their own door, because of harmful policies. And then you add COVID-19 restrictions to that. And then you add this worry about this fear of repercussions because of being able to access public benefits. That all has impacts on one's mental health, on stress and anxiety and worry, and all of that can lead to more severe mental health conditions. And to the broader scope of what's been happening with COVID-19, loss of jobs, loss of housing, issues with rent, food insecurity, all of that has led to stress and mental health concerns as well. And then from a mental health perspective, even being able to, like, telehealth, of course, is something that we try to promote and we think is a very good thing, and the restrictions need to continue to be expanded. But when thinking about immigrant populations and then thinking about public charge rule, for example, and this lack of trust, like when you add telehealth and these extra barriers, and then being on video or on the phone, it's hard to build that trust. And then you think about confidentiality and who is in the same room or same house as you are when you're talking about things that make you very vulnerable. So all those things, like both of you have mentioned so many times, everything is so complex, and it's hard to kind of tease these things out, but absolutely these policies have had very detrimental impacts on mental health.
Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I haven't had too many families who are unwilling to seek mental health care because of public charge, but I have seen people have mental health emerge because they have been frightened to seek medical care recently. And I was really bothered. And what I couldn't understand, it was just last week, and the family said, oh, I've been refusing, I've been here for 6 years, and I was thinking about finally going and finding and applying for county assistance. And then I discovered that, then people cautioned me against the gold card, but my health is deteriorating. And it was just so unnecessary. Even the safe space I thought we had created hadn't been sufficient, but now her anxiety and depression about, worries about how her future would proceed was really impacted. So it's anxiety around all of it has definitely taken a toll.
I can't help but think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And the baseline is safety and security. And if the example you gave, Isha, of like people don't even want to walk out of their house, because of the fear of public charge, and then now the pandemic, that's just, again, that added layer of trauma, that added layer of anxiety and mental health concerns for families. Yeah. So we've got about 4 minutes. And so what I thought I'd close with is maybe just any last minute thoughts you have on mental health and immigrants, maybe your sort of wish, sort of what is that magic wand wish that you would want to see to improve the systems or to improve policies for mental health and immigrant families. So we'll start with Sarah.
That's a really big question. I know it's oversimplified, but just to be kind, because I repeatedly see that there's so many times that kindness could have won. Someone would have continued with services if you had listened and been kind in the process. So hear the story, not making your assumptions, and having a kind response, whether it's facial expression or, directing to where the water fountain is. I mean, just basic stuff in an organization, reaching the front desk, calling in, asking for help when your reaction is kind versus negative or short. And, things like, especially as an immigrant, maybe if you're not understanding all of the nuances of the language, body language really matters. Tone of voice really, really matters. And so all of these times where kindness could have prevailed, but it didn't, I think is treating people nicely.
We put together a set of principles on how we would like to see, we as CLASP would like to see mental health redefined, and I can put that in the chat, but this actually has a lot of resonance, I think, when we're thinking particularly about immigrant populations and immigrant children. And so the categories we looked at were redefining how we see mental health and thinking more of that asset-based approach rather than diagnosis-based, and wellness. Expanding access to care, so making sure that people have the access that they need, whether it's through insurance or even access to supports. Ensuring services are culturally responsive, addressing social needs, and then strengthening the existing infrastructure that includes data and surveillance as well. Not surveillance in terms of the harmful surveillance, but in terms of data surveillance. And then building a diverse and robust workforce that is in terms of credentialing and making sure peer support providers are included, and then diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, whether you're LGBTQ, identify as LGBTQ, disability status, et cetera, et cetera. So those elements are key in order to make sure that systems and policies are changed. So that was my long answer to your short question.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think our time is pretty much up for today. So thank you so much for your thoughts on mental health and immigrant families. And, being a part of this panel really gives me hope that we are going to see one day where immigrant families can have better access to mental health, and not just immigrant families, but I think everybody in general. I think that this is a movement in the United States, and I'm hopeful right now that we're moving towards better access for everybody for mental health services. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Adriana, Isha, and Sarah, for that excellent panel. Now we can move forward with our next panel. If our next panel can turn on their videos as I introduce them. Thank you so much. Great. So now I'd like to introduce our final panel for today, focused on rejecting hate by confronting racism and xenophobic crimes in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. I'll start by introducing the panel's moderator, Sharon Jones, who is the Director of Texas Racial Equity Collaborative at Children at Risk. Her career has included positions of leadership in public affairs and higher education administration. She is a former Director of Political Strategies at the ACLU of Texas. I'd also like to introduce Nneka Achapu, who is the National Civic Engagement Coordinator at Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI. Nneka is a political and public affairs strategist based in Houston, Texas. She has centered her work on United States, Africa trade relations, immigration, and civil and political engagement for the African community. Born in Nigeria, she was born in Nigeria and raised in Italy, and she is deeply passionate about her African roots and protecting the rights of all immigrants. Finally, I'd like to introduce Daishi Miguel Tanaka, who is an immigration policy associate at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, where he supports AAJC's national immigration advocacy campaigns and Value Our Families. He is a Filipino-Japanese undocumented DACA recipient and was also featured in the video that we showed earlier. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Sharon. Oh, Sharon, I think you are mute.
Thanks, that's a sign of the times. I'm so thrilled to meet you, Daishi, and to see you again, Nneka. And I'm really happy that we'll be able to get into this conversation today, rejecting hate, confronting racism, and xenophobic crimes. And just for the purposes of making sure that we're using terms that are familiar to all, I want to just give a brief definition of xenophobia, which of course is the dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. I've been reading America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States by Erica Lee. And she says that xenophobia just doesn't reveal itself through a bigoted relative who says stuff about those Mexicans at Thanksgiving dinner. It is a form of racism that has been embedded in our laws. And we know that's true. And we have seen lately an increase in hate crimes against people who happen to be immigrants. The National Institute of Justice says that 60% of hate crimes are motivated by racial bias. And while free speech is protected, it may be used in court as evidence of a hate crime. We also know that 63% of hate crimes were against children and they involved violent assaults. Hate crimes certainly aren't a new phenomenon, but due to a rise in crimes against Asian Americans by nearly 150% in 2020, an increased attention has been brought to hate crimes and xenophobia. We also know that in 2020, the FBI released data for 2019 that broke a record for the most hate crimes in a year. And of the more than 7,000 reported, 51 were fatal. And 22 of these killings came from a domestic terrorist attack in El Paso, Texas, targeting Walmart shoppers of Mexican descent. And so my question to you, as we talk about this increase in hate crimes and xenophobia, what may be attributed to that? And so I'll start with you, Daishi.
Oh, thank you all so much for having me today. And I didn't realize that the video was shown to participants in the beginning, so I got my haircut after that. So it's definitely shorter. But yeah, in all seriousness, thank you for raising this question. I mean, look, the Asian American community has long struggled right, for visibility and equity, and now our communities are facing just additional physical and mental harms out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you've mentioned earlier, Stop API Hate, an amazing California-based coalition, has recorded around 7,000 hate incidents involving Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders nationwide since the beginning of the pandemic. That's 7,000 lives, right? And I think we can't understate that. It's like real people with families, right? And it's jarring. And so in thinking about, and a lot of the harms have taken many forms, right? So it's taken forms of hostility and suspicion that Asian Americans were carriers of the coronavirus, to verbal abuse, harassment, right? And fatal physical violence, right? And so I think while many have maybe shocked and surprised by the hate, we can't forget the fact that this latest wave of hate comes after years of attacks by the Trump administration. And furthermore, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia is part of the deep structural racism that's long impacted communities in America and beyond, right? So anti-Asian hate has manifested in many points throughout our history, including the Yellow Peril, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, and the scapegoating and the violence against Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities after 9/11. So, we know from experiences of AMEMSA communities who really continue to face harassment, since after nearly 2 decades after 9/11, that we can't expect that anti-Asian sentiment will fade away once we are past this pandemic, and we have to be vigilant in order to combat it.
Thanks so much, Daishi. Nneka, did you have something to add in regards to what you believe is exacerbating hate crimes in the United States?
I think definitely ignorance and the vilification of immigrants. It's been for many years, we've seen that there's a lack of representation in terms of immigrants. We are, not we, but I feel the perception is very negative. And unfortunately, there hasn't been much provision to improve that situation. Educating people on why xenophobia is very dangerous. One thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of how it manifests in other areas, in policy, for example, we see that the constant erasure of Black immigrants and African immigrants from policymaking, that has very dire consequences. We see the lack of language access, for example, at the border for Cameroonian immigrants, for asylees that are not coming from the conventional way. We know for a fact that a lot of the immigrants that are coming from Africa, all the way from Cameroon or South Africa, all the way to Mexico, for example, is not very well documented or spoken about. And that erasure affects the outcomes of what the work that we do. And so those are other ways in which xenophobia manifests itself through policymaking, where it affects the people that are not represented in these policies.
That's a really good point that leads us to my next point of discussion about othering. And we know that othering is the act of viewing or treating a person or a group of people as intrinsically different from an alien to oneself. And, of course, the term illegal alien, referring to undocumented immigrants, has the effect of othering families and children. And even as far back as 1968 with Jane Elliott's brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment, we know how easy it is to persuade people to other their friends, their neighbors, and classmates. And so, of course, othering folks who are coming to this country is a phenomenon that spreads pretty quickly. And of course, as you just mentioned, it's from the top down. We see it with political figures, and quite naturally, we would also see that with teachers and with parents. And so my question to you is, what impact does othering have on families and children? Daishi.
Of course. Well, I just want to say it's such an honor being here because, you know, because as you said, anti-Blackness and the immigrant rights policymaking is real. And I just want to send all my energy and love to Baji, and great work that Undocumented is doing too, and Haitian Bridge Alliance. And it's a big victory on the TPS for Haiti recently. So, and the work must continue, right? To make sure that other communities and countries falls under or get relief finally for so long. It's really urgent. So I just want to say that when it comes to the othering, I think that othering of Asian Americans can really originate into kind of two phenomena that people may have heard. One is like the model minority myth, and then the second is like the yellow peril, right? Which I would think that both would fall under a broader umbrella of Asian foreignness. So starting with the model minority, it's this notion that, you know, Asians are successful, are succeeding in America despite their status as minorities, working and studying, saving, and sacrificing for their future, right? But there's also this concept of like yellow peril, where like Asian and Asian Americans are also depicted as military and cultural or economic enemies, right? And unfair competitors of American jobs and education. And so in thinking about why do these like almost contracting phenomenon exist, you know, I looked to research of Professor Natsu Taylor Saito, and she wrote an article in 1997 that really is resonant today, that looks at Japanese American internment cases to figure out what happened, right? And she finds that there's a racialized identification. There was a racialized identification of Japanese Americans that really as foreign, right? Regardless of citizenship, regardless of how long they've been here, regardless of how they've been integral to their communities, that people they allowed on unlawful actions to be taken and, you know, essentially detain and intern these neighbors, right? And it's just baffling, but it's this constant underlying vision of foreignness that really allows us like almost a snap of the finger, like transformation of like positive to negative, right? Like inside outside sort of thing. And I think this foreignness really translates to, I think, two main things for immigration policy. So first of all, there's a significant invisibility of Asian Americans when it comes to the conversation about undocumented immigrants, right? When 1 in 7, and I think I said this in the video, 1 in 7 Asian immigrants is undocumented, but people don't talk about that. And there's so much work that API orgs are doing to raise that conversation. And so the American demos can really justify the lack of meaningful legislation in terms of broad legalization of undocumented folks, and the incredibly long wait times that family-based visas can entail, you know, up to 20 years, 2 decades waiting periods. And, you know, what me personally, I was affected by when I've been waiting for God knows how long until my grandpa passed away earlier this month or in January. So we're kicked out of line, right? And so, and secondly, this foreignness really is pervasive to the invisibility of the experiences between Southeast Asians and East Asians, right? So Southeast Asian immigrants are, I think, 3 to 4 times more likely to be deported for old criminal convictions than any other immigrant group. And roughly around 15,000 Southeast Asian Americans currently live with a final order for removal. And I think over 80% of these are based on past criminal convictions. So, you know, there's a real enforcement issue that affects our communities, and it's largely invisible because there's this model minority myth that's like, oh, Asians are doing fine, right? And it's like, no, a lot of our community members are being targeted and are being detained in a prison and then being transferred to ICE and deported to a country that they barely remember. So immigration legislation has to really has been adopting provision excluding immigrants with criminal convictions in order to pass and move along the congressional process, thereby excluding our community members. And I think all of that are byproducts of, again, going back to this like greater narrative of foreignness that has been pervasive in our communities.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned sort of the ease with which Japanese were interned is sort of a point of how easy it is for Americans to other Americans, depending on the situation. And it reminded me of the Martin Niemöller quote, you know, first they came for the socialists and I was not one, and so I didn't speak up. And then they came for the Jews and I was not one, so I didn't speak up. But when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me. And that's really gets at the heart of what we have to talk about when it comes to othering and how easy it is to alienate and to treat badly fellow humans. And so, Nick, I want to ask you on the same subject, what are some of the ways African immigrants to America are othered, and how is this affecting children and families?
I think for African immigrants, we kind of fall in the same category as Asian immigrants, where we have model minority myth, and vice versa. African immigrants have a very different view of Black people when coming here. And so there is a clash between, you know, knowing how African immigrants are here and how they relate to Black people who are here. And so with that, we see that people don't consider immigration as a Black issue, even though it is. We see that, we've seen that in recently with, as Danny mentioned, we were able to get TPS for Haiti. But there's many other countries, unfortunately, that are needing that assistance, and the attention and the focus isn't often there. Why? Because we don't consider, or at least most people don't consider immigration as a Black issue. And that is a problem that has been going on for years. There's over 4 million Black immigrants here in the US who are now part of this country. And their erasure and invisibility is often seen in the way we talk about immigration. I have seen many times, unfortunately, where people in detention passed away and there was no backlash or no anger in the same way that other immigrants are being treated. And it's an issue. It's been an issue and continues to be an issue. But luckily, we continue to have advocates and organizations that are working on these issues.
Yeah, and in that same line of thinking, let's talk a bit about what organizations that you are working with, or that your work intersects with. What are they doing, or what are you doing directly or indirectly to combat and to address racial hatred? Nneka, will you go first on this?
Sure. So the Black Alliance for Just Immigration is a social and racial justice organization advocates for Black immigrants. We do that by providing policy briefs and information and education to our communities. And so we also litigate cases. For example, during the census, we worked on a case whenever they were trying to block undocumented people from being counted within the census. We litigated that case along with, I think, the Civil Lawyers Committee. But anyways, aside from litigating these cases, we try to educate our community on the issues and assist them in building power by explaining what is going on with current legislation and how adverse immigration policies are affecting our community. So we've been doing this work. I joined at the beginning of the pandemic as the census coordinator, and it's been lovely to work with my people, for my people, It's been an exhilarating experience being able to really do the work. And we also work in civic engagement. Part of fixing this problem of invisibility is giving a voice to our people, and doing so by educating on the mechanism of how to get involved in these policies, how to really make a change. And so that's what we do, and that's my role at Baji.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to hear what you're doing, Daishi.
Yes, well, thank you. So cool, because I heard and read about Baji when I was in college, about like all the work that they're doing, and it's just such an honor, speaking on this panel today. So I work at Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC. We're a national level civil rights organization focusing on issues that affect the Asian American community across the country, and I support immigration portfolio. So strengthening the family-based immigration system, pushing back against the enforcement of Southeast Asian communities, and fighting for a path to citizenship along with other coalition partners. But we have a lot of issue areas, particularly when it comes to the census as well, tech and telecom, media, and most notably, as of late, the anti-Asian hate work that we're doing. Firstly, we set up the Asian American Advancing Justice affiliation, which is an affiliation of 5 affiliates across the country, set up the Stand Against Hatred website to capture individual reports of hate crimes and hate incidents in response to the hike of in response to the spike after the 2016 election cycle. And in addition to that, we've been encouraging people to share information about the hate that they've experienced. So we're working to make resources available to impacted folks. We're working with the Lawyers Committee for legal assistance and referrals to social services and court, available through their Stop Hate hotline. So it's 1-844-NO-HATE. And I'll put a lot of the resources in the chat as well. And lastly, we also realized that another resource we're really proud to offer is as a result of realizing that the fear in our communities is real. And so we want to equip people with the knowledge and power to take action as well. And so AJC partnered with an organization called Hollaback to make free online trainings available to teach folks techniques about how to intervene and de-escalate hate incidents as they occur, right? And so we have a 3-part training series on responding to harassment. And as of, I think a few weeks ago, we trained over 96,000 individuals to empower to take action. And so there's a big demand for this. And so, but we want to continue to make it free. So I'll put our links on the chat if people want to register. This is led by our incredible Director of Strategic Initiatives, who's been leading this effort. And yeah, happy to take questions as well.
Thank you. That's amazing, the work that you're doing, and much needed. And it takes this kind of work on all fronts. And typically our laws reflect the core values of our nation, as do the lack of laws also reflect our core values. And so, many of us were pleased that President Biden signed into law this year the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which included the No Hate Act. And these laws increase reporting, encourage prevention, training, and education, and also establish a hate crime hotline. But there's more that can be done. And so I want to know from you all, what more can government do to combat racial hate and xenophobia? And, as you're talking, let me know your thoughts on whether or not hearts and minds can actually be legislated, and how do we go about making the deep change that needs to be made from all levels. Daishi, will you go first?
Sure, definitely. So I think I can definitely speak to a little bit more about what the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act does. Yeah, and I love to personally research like what more can be done that isn't covered. I'm not a legal expert on this, but just as a quick intro to what it does, it really, the legislation provides for more accurate and improved response, accurate data and improved response to the hate crimes that are impacting POCs, religious minorities, immigrants, folks from the LGBTQ community by improving data collection and law enforcement policies on identifying, investigating, and reporting hate crimes. So it provides grants for state-run hotlines for reporting and connecting to support services, and really creates opportunity to restore communities and address the root causes of hate crimes through alternative sentencing for offenders. So investing in better quality data and reporting infrastructure, at least our org believes that it's vital to address racial equality in the long term, right? And so I think when it comes to confront and uproot just like systems of white supremacy, there needs to be I want to address like that feeds into like historic targeting over policing and like criminalizing, right? So like accurate data on hate crimes, especially including for limited English proficiency community members, is a necessary just like first step, right? And it doesn't address everything. And I think there is what government can do, from my understanding, is that it could do a lot to really push comprehensive community-centered solutions in the long run. And like this is just one notch of the rung of the ladder. And I think that can legislation change hearts and minds? Look, that's really hard. I think there is an upper limit in which federal level legislation can do. I think if it's executed well, if it is community centered, if it involves people, it could result in better solutions. But that just takes a lot of coordination with state and local agencies to make that happen, right? And then in that process of executing local programs, like involving community members, community leaders, to make sure that things are actually implemented and like executed in an equitable fashion. So I think that like there's a lot of funding that can be done, but obviously with like a lot more thinking in terms of how the funding is distributed, and who's receiving the money and how the money is being used is really important to get right. And so I think the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act is like one step, and then there's a lot more work to be done.
Thanks. You talked a little bit earlier about relief efforts and how sometimes, or a lot of times, undocumented families are cut out of relief that's offered either pandemic or in an emergency situation. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you just said too about the changing of hearts and minds, because the message that's given to children and families, if you are undocumented, is that you don't matter. And that same message is given to children and families of those who are not immigrants, that immigrant families don't matter. And so I think a lot of the changing of the hearts and minds comes from what we deem as important enough to put into law to protect immigrant families. That's all the way from policies that are made for or that are disseminated from agencies, ordinances that cities pass, all the way up to what's done in the White House, sends that message to children and families that either you do or you don't matter. We've got a couple of minutes left. So the last thing I wanted to ask each of you, these are trying times. They can be traumatic and triggering for all of us as we look around and see increasing rates of hate crimes and increasing levels of xenophobia. But I want to know who and or what is inspiring to you in this moment and what gives you hope for the future of children and families of immigrants. And so Nneka, will you please address that?
Sure. I believe other activists and the interest of people, there is still good. And the fact that there is still good around gives me hope for the future. Otherwise, it would be bleak every day. There are people that are advocating for change and dismantling this racist system. And as hard as it is, as difficult as it is, those are the people that give me hope. So the fight continues.
Thanks, Daishi.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I came to this country when I was 6 years old, right? And in Japan, I'm half Filipino as well. So in Japan, I got bullied a lot for being bigger, being dark-skinned, being a foreigner, facing that in my birth country. And I remember walking into my first grade elementary school class in America and seeing kids of all colors, backgrounds, nationalities, personalities, all putting their hands over their hearts under the flag. And that moment showed me that the promise of America is that it's precisely because of your differences that makes you unique, not our commonalities, right? And so that individually we can add different shades to the mosaic that make a beautiful picture of this country. So I think through storytelling, through policy advocacy, through organizing, like we can gradually make this America come true and maintain this vision of America for the years to come, into that, where immigrants can feel like they're part of something here, they're home here. And so I always think about these really great moments in which this country was here for me. And I think about how we can make sure that those good parts stay, and the things that are negative are completely uprooted, and that we can fight gradually day by day to get to that point.
That's really beautiful. I'm made hopeful by the two of you and by the work that's being done right now, and the conversations that are being held now. And I think these conversations are being held more freely than, at least in my memory. Truth is being shared. A light is being shined on people who have for too long been unseen and unheard. And so I appreciate the work that you two are doing to shine that light. There's power in the individual and collective stories of children and families who are immigrants. And so these conversations like this are important to make sure that those stories are told. I really enjoyed your portion of the video that was shown earlier, Daishi, for that reason, because it's an important story that needs to be shared. And it's our responsibility to listen to those stories and to act. And so I thank you for your time today. And this discussion continues, and I'm sure we will have other opportunities to keep at it. And so I thank you, and I will turn this back over to Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Sharon, Mecca, and Daishi. That was an incredible panel. I am just so honored to be moderating and being the MC for this event with you all. You all are doing such amazing work. Thank you so much for centering the experiences, stories, and lives of Black and Asian American immigrant communities. Okay, now I'd finally like to introduce Yael Ross, who will be providing closing thoughts and a call to action. Yael is a special consultant on immigrant children at Children at Risk. Before joining Children at Risk, she served as the executive director of SUR, a network of KIPP-inspired schools in Mexico that serve more than 2,000 children and families from underprivileged communities. She has served in the field of education for more than 10 years and deeply believes education is a matter of social justice and that it is every children's rights to have access to it and a better future. Yael, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Gabriela, so much. And I am so moved from the previous panelists and their experiences. As an immigrant myself, recently a citizen, this is wonderful, being able to hear and learn from others and being able to support, lift others' voices. It's wonderful. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us here today. As you all know, the fight to advocate for our immigrant children and their families never ends. So let's not forget the importance of highlighting intersectionality within immigrant communities and to continue lifting their voices. Please join me in thanking all the panelists for participating and sharing their experiences and expertise with us today, and to continue to support and get involved with issues affecting immigrant children and their families. There are several ways you can join us. One of them is following the Children Thrive Action Network, CITAN, at Let Kids Thrive. Is that right, Gabriela? Let Kids Thrive?
Children Thrive Action Network.
But the username, is it at Let's Keep
Oh,
Track?
yes, sorry about that, yes.
Okay, thank you. And expand the movement by encouraging your partners to join CTAN and help us advocate for policies that center on the needs of immigrant children of immigrants. Also, we invite you to sign your organization on CTAN's policy principles if you haven't already. And if you are Texas-based, please consider joining the Texas Immigration Network, TIN. So once again, thank you all so much for being here. And for any questions on how to get involved, please contact my colleague here, Lindsay Wilkerson, for more information. Thank you again, everyone, so much.
Just one final thank you to all of our panelists and everything that we heard today at the federal, state, and local level. There's so much opportunity to engage in this advocacy together. We must remember to center the voices and experiences of impacted community members and immigrant families in all that we do, and make sure that we're also centering Asian American and Black immigrant communities in our advocacy as well. So thank you once again to everybody. Please join us in our advocacy, join us with CTAN. We look forward to working together. Bye all.